Flames leapt into the night sky, painting the snow-covered ground in shades of orange and red. The barn at Harper's Hollow burned fiercely, its wooden beams crackling like gunshots in the cold Wyoming air. Ruth Calloway stood facing a man with a revolver, her face illuminated by the dancing fire. Her eyes, once soft with kindness, now burned with the same intensity as the blaze behind her. "You can take my life," she said, her voice steady despite the gun barrel aimed at her heart. "But you cannot take the truth." The man's finger tightened on the trigger. A flash. The sound of a gunshot echoed across the valley. Then darkness. 3 months earlier, the wind had a cruel way of finding every crack in a Wyoming homestead. Ruth Calloway had spent the better part of 3 winters stuffing rags into the gaps around her window frames, but still the cold found its way in. Tonight was no different. Snow piled against the north side of the house, muting the world beyond her 4 walls to an eerie hush, save for the occasional groan of old timbers settling against the storm. Ruth sat by the hearth, stirring a pot of stew that simmered low over the coals. Her rocking chair stood empty beside her, as it had for 3 years now. She didn't sit in Samuel's chair, couldn't bring herself to claim that space as her own. Sometimes in the deep quiet of nights like this, she imagined she could still hear the gentle creak of its runners against the floorboards, as if Samuel's ghost was keeping her company. The spoon in her hand stilled, a sound, not the wind, not the house settling, something else, something out of place. Ruth set the spoon down and crossed to the window, peering out into the swirling snow. The barn stood 30 yards from the house, a dark silhouette against the white landscape. A faint light flickered from within a light she hadn't lit. Without hesitation, Ruth reached for Samuel's Winchester rifle that hung above the door, checking that it was loaded before wrapping herself in a heavy shawl. She wasn't one to spook easily. 5 miles from the nearest neighbor, a woman learned to handle trouble on her own. The cold bit through her skirts as she trudged through knee-deep snow, lantern held high in one hand, rifle ready in the other. Her steps were sure despite the storm. Ruth Calloway didn't believe in ghosts, but she believed in the foolishness of men. The barn door was slightly ajar, creaking back and forth in the wind. Ruth tightened her grip on the rifle, pushed the door wider with her foot, and lifted the lantern high. That's when she saw them. A man slumped against the far wall, one hand pressed tight to his side where dark blood stained his coat. His hat had fallen beside him, dusted with snow. Next to him sat a girl no older than 9, small and wiry, wrapped in a threadbare shawl and clutching a trembling pup to her chest. The girl's eyes found Ruth's, first not begging, not frightened, just watching with a steadiness that belied her years. "Ma'am," the man's voice was strained, barely audible over the howling wind. "Just needed shelter from the storm. We'll be gone by sunrise." Ruth's finger eased off the trigger, but she kept the rifle ready. "You're bleeding all over my hay." The man's lips twitched in what might have been an attempt at a smile. "Reckon you're right about that." Ruth studied them both. The man's face was pale from blood loss, but his eyes were clear and direct. The girl beside him sat with her back straight, chin lifted in a way that tugged at something long buried in Ruth's chest. "What's your name, child?" Ruth asked, her voice softening slightly. "Grace," the girl replied. "And this is Buddy. We found him on the road." She stroked the pup's matted fur. "He doesn't have a name yet." Ruth nodded, then looked expectantly at the man. "Ethan," he said after a pause. "Ethan Foster." She didn't press for more. Names meant little out here. It was the truth behind them that held weight, and Ruth had long ago learned that truth was rarely offered freely. "I've got no spare rooms," she said, glancing back toward the house. "But the barn has a roof. Try not to bleed out before morning." Ethan gave a slow nod. "Much obliged, ma'am." Ruth didn't offer more. She turned and made her way back to the house, boots crunching through the fresh snow. But her steps were slower now, her mind churning with questions she couldn't quite silence. Back inside, she ladled stew into 2 wooden bowls, wrapped a loaf of bread in a clean cloth, and lit a second lantern. She hesitated by the door, then set the rifle aside. When she returned to the barn, Grace was still sitting sentinel beside her father, small hand resting protectively on his arm. Ruth placed the food on an overturned crate and set the lantern beside it. "Eat while it's warm," she said simply, then turned to leave. "Thank you," Ethan's voice followed her, not with suspicion, but with something gentler. Respect perhaps, or gratitude, too tired to clothe itself in more words. From her window, Ruth watched the lanterns glow within the barn. Samuel would have invited them into the house without question. A man's measure is taken by how he treats those in need, he'd often said. Ruth touched the cold glass of the window, remembering his hands always warm, despite the Wyoming chill. "What would you do, Sam?" she whispered to the empty room. "We never turned away someone who needed help." Ruth crossed to the dresser and pulled open the bottom drawer. Beneath folded linens lay a faded piece of cloth, a military bandage stained with old blood. She ran her fingers over it, remembering the story Samuel had told 100 times, how he'd been wounded at Gettysburg, how a stranger had stopped to bind his wounds when others fled, saving his life. "Someone saved you once," she murmured. "Perhaps this is how we repay that debt." That night, Ruth slept fitfully, waking at every sound, listening for footsteps or voices beyond the howling wind. When dawn broke pale and hesitant through the clouds, she found herself standing by the stove, stirring a pot of oatmeal with dried apples and cinnamon, Samuel's favorite. She covered 2 bowls with plates to keep them warm and wrapped them in clean feed sacks. The snow had eased, though the air still held its bite as she made her way back to the barn. The girl Grace was awake, sitting cross-legged by her father, who appeared to be sleeping. His breathing seemed labored, and even in the dim light, Ruth could see the fever's flush on his cheeks. "How long has he been like this?" Ruth asked, setting down the food. Grace looked up, those steady eyes now clouded with worry. "Since before the sun came. He's hot, but he keeps saying he's cold." Ruth knelt beside Ethan, pressing the back of her hand to his forehead. The heat radiating from his skin confirmed her suspicions. The wound's infected. She gently moved his coat aside to examine the bloodied bandage beneath. "This needs proper cleaning." Grace watched her intently. "Are you a doctor?" A ghost of a smile crossed Ruth's face. "I was a nurse. During the war." "Can you help him?" Ruth studied the girl's face, so young yet bearing a weight no child should carry. "I can try," she said finally, "but we need to get him to the house. I can't tend him properly out here." Together they managed to rouse Ethan enough to help him stumble through the snow to the cabin. Ruth settled him on the small daybed in the front room closest to the fire. As she gathered clean cloths and boiled water, she could feel Grace watching her every move. "Your pa," Ruth said, as she prepared to clean the wound. "How did this happen?" Grace glanced at her father, then back to Ruth. "Bad men," she said simply. "They came in the night, said Papa knew too much." Ruth's hands stilled. "Too much about what?" But Grace only shook her head, suddenly looking every bit her young age. "I don't know. Papa made me hide. I just heard the shots." As Ruth worked to clean and dress Ethan's wound, a bullet grazed that had festered, she found her mind traveling back to another time, another wounded man. She'd spent 2 years in field hospitals, holding the hands of boys too young to die, stemming blood that flowed like rivers. After the war, she'd vowed never to see such suffering again. Yet here she was, hands steady as they'd been taught to be, fighting the same battle against infection and fever. "You have skilled hands," Ethan murmured, his eyes fluttering open as she finished bandaging his side. "Rest," Ruth replied. "Save your strength." He caught her wrist weakly. "Why are you helping us?" Ruth paused, the question heavier than it had any right to be. "Because someone once helped my husband," she answered finally. "And because your daughter shouldn't have to watch her father die." Later, as Ethan fell into a fitful sleep and Grace finally succumbed to exhaustion in the rocking chair, Ruth stood by the window watching the sun break through the clouds. 3 years she'd kept to herself, speaking only when necessary on her monthly trips into Ironwood for supplies. 3 years of whispers behind her back, the strange widow Calloway, stubborn as the Wyoming winter, refusing all offers to buy her struggling ranch. Now she'd invited strangers into her home, risking gossip that would spread like wildfire. Victor Montgomery would hear of it before sundown. The thought of the banker-turned-mayor made her jaw tighten. His generous offers for her land had grown increasingly insistent, his thinly veiled threats less subtle with each refusal. Something about Ethan Foster's wound and the fear in his daughter's eyes made Ruth wonder if Montgomery's reach extended beyond Harper's Hollow. She was lost in these thoughts when Grace appeared at her side, small face solemn in the morning light. "My mama died too," the girl said quietly, looking up at Ruth. "When I was born." Ruth's heart twisted. "I'm sorry. Papa says she's watching over us from heaven." Grace touched the window glasses. "He says the same about your husband." "Does he now?" Ruth asked, surprised. Grace nodded. "I heard him praying last night. He asked God to thank Mr. Calloway for the kindness of his wife. Something warm and unexpected bloomed in Ruth's chest. Not happiness exactly, but a softening of the hard edges grief had carved into her soul. "Your papa should rest," she said gently, steering Grace away from the window. "And you should eat. There's work to be done around a farm storm or no storm." For the next 2 days, Ruth tended to Ethan's fever-changing bandages and brewing willow bark tea to ease his pain. Grace proved herself useful beyond her years, feeding chickens without being asked and carefully washing dishes with a concentration that spoke of someone used to taking on adult responsibilities. On the morning of the third day, Ruth knew she couldn't delay her trip to town any longer. Supplies were running low and she needed medicine for Ethan, whose fever, though lessened, still hadn't broken completely. "I'm going into Ironwood," she told Grace, who was helping collect eggs. "You stay close to the house. Keep the door barred." Grace's eyes widened slightly. "Because of the bad men." Ruth hesitated. "Just a precaution. Your father is improving, but he still needs rest." The girl nodded solemnly. "I can take care of him. I've done it before." The 5-mile journey to Ironwood usually brought Ruth a measure of peacetime alone with her thoughts away from the empty spaces of her home that still echoed with Samuel's absence. Today, however, her mind was crowded with questions about her mysterious guests. Ironwood had grown since Ruth first arrived as a new bride 12 years ago. The promise of the Transcontinental Railroad had transformed what was once a small trading post into a bustling town with aspirations of becoming a transportation hub. New buildings lined the main street, and the sounds of construction rang out from the north end, where the railroad offices were being expanded. Ruth tied her horse outside Mercer's general store, steeling herself for the inevitable whispers. Sure enough, conversation hushed as she pushed through the door, the bell announcing her presence with cheerful ignorance of the sudden tension. Mildred Palmer stood by the dry goods, her pinched face lighting with poorly disguised interest. "Ruth Calloway," she said, voice carrying to ensure everyone heard. "Rare to see you twice in a month." Ruth nodded coolly, moving past her to the counter, where Joseph Mercer waited, his expression carefully neutral. "Mrs. Calloway," he greeted. "What can I help you with today?" Ruth handed him her list. "I'll need these items plus any carbolic acid you might have." Mercer's eyebrows rose slightly. "Carbolic acid? Someone injured out at Harper's Hollow." Before Ruth could answer, Mildred glided closer, her voice dropping to a stage whisper. "I heard there's a man staying at your place, Ruth. A stranger." Her eyes gleamed with malicious curiosity. "Not proper for a widow, is it?" Ruth met her gaze steadily. "I wasn't aware you'd appointed yourself the guardian of propriety, Mildred." Several patrons snickered, quickly silenced by Mildred's glare. "We look out for our own in Ironwood," she sniffed, "or at least those who consider themselves part of this community." The barb struck its intended target. Ruth had always kept to herself even when Samuel was alive. After his death, her isolation had only deepened, a fact many in town interpreted as pride or disdain. "I'll get these items for you, Mrs. Calloway," Mercer interjected, clearly uncomfortable with the tension. "Might be a few minutes." As Ruth waited, the store's bell jingled again. Sheriff Franklin Davis entered, removing his hat as he nodded to the patrons. His weathered face registered mild surprise at seeing Ruth. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, approaching. "Didn't expect to see you in town today, what with the road still being cleared from the storm." "Sheriff," Ruth acknowledged. "Supplies don't wait for good weather." Davis glanced around, noting the obvious interest of the other customers. "Mind if I have a word outside?" Ruth followed him onto the boardwalk, the cold air a relief after the store's stifling atmosphere. "There's talk," Davis said without preamble, "about a wounded man at your place." Ruth's expression remained impassive. Since when is offering shelter during a storm cause for the sheriff's concern? Davis sighed, his breath clouding in the cold air. "There's more to it than that, Ruth, and I think you know it." He lowered his voice. "Word came down from the territorial governor's office. They're looking for a man, a lawyer who's been investigating land deals along the proposed railroad route. Man named Foster." Ruth's heart stuttered, but she kept her face carefully blank. "And why would this concern me?" "Because Victor Montgomery's mighty interested in finding this fella. Put out word that there's a reward for information." Davis studied her face. "And because I know you're not one to turn away someone in need, even if it puts you at risk." Is that what Samuel would have done? Turned away a wounded man and his child? Davis's expression softened at the mention of her late husband. Sam was a good man, one of the best I've known. He hesitated, which is why I'm warning you. Montgomery's been consolidating his hold on this town since before Sam died. Now with the railroad coming through, he's eliminating obstacles. Anyone who stands in his way. The unspoken implication hung between them. Samuel Calloway's accident 3 years ago had never sat right with many in town, though none dared voice their suspicions openly. Be careful who you let through your door, Ruth, Davis said finally. Some troubles aren't worth inviting in. As Ruth drove her wagon back to Harper's Hollow, the sheriff's warning echoed in her mind. She'd suspected Ethan Foster wasn't simply a traveler caught in a storm, but the confirmation that he was being hunted, and by Montgomery no less settled like a stone in her stomach. Samuel had been investigating the sudden changes in property boundaries around Ironwood before his death. Something's not right, he'd told her. Land that's been in families for generations, suddenly changing hands, deeds altered, surveys redrawn. 3 days later, he'd been found crushed beneath his own wagon, the axle mysteriously broken on flat, even ground. The accident that never felt like an accident, too. As Harper's Hollow came into view, Ruth noticed Grace standing on the porch waving urgently. She snapped the reins, urging the horses faster. What is it? She called as she pulled up to the house. Men came, Grace said, her voice tight with fear. They rode around the property but didn't come to the door. Papa told me to hide in the cellar until they left. Ruth quickly unhitched the horses and moved the wagon behind the barn, out of sight from the main road. Inside, she found Ethan sitting up on the daybed, Samuel's rifle across his lap. His face was still pale, but his eyes were alert, the fever finally broken. You had visitors, Ruth said, setting down her purchases. Ethan nodded grimly. Montgomery's men. They're looking for me. So I've been told, Ruth replied. The sheriff mentioned a lawyer investigating land deals. That would be you, I take it. Ethan studied her face, seemingly weighing how much to reveal. Yes, he finally said. I was appointed by the territorial governor to investigate claims of fraud in railroad land acquisitions. Montgomery's been manipulating surveys, forging deeds, intimidating homesteaders into selling for a fraction of what their land is worth. And for this, they shot you. A bitter smile crossed his face. They did worse than that. His eyes darted to Grace, who had busied herself arranging Ruth's purchases on the table. They killed my wife, Hannah. Made it look like a robbery gone wrong. Ruth's breath caught. I'm sorry. Hannah was a teacher, Ethan continued, his voice softening. She was helping me organize documents, testimonies from people who had been forced off their land. She found a pattern properties changing hands just before the railroad survey teams came through, always ending up under Montgomery's control. Ruth moved to the window, looking out across the snow-covered fields that stretched to the horizon. Land that had been in Samuel's family for 2 generations. Land that Montgomery had been trying to buy since before Samuel's body was cold in the ground. My husband, she said quietly, was investigating similar concerns before he died. Ethan's gaze sharpened. Samuel Calloway, he said, I know the name. He sent letters to the governor's office raising concerns about property disputes in Ironwood County. Ruth turned surprise evident on her face. You knew of Samuel? Not personally, Ethan admitted, but his letters were part of what prompted the investigation. He hesitated. Mrs. Calloway, your husband's death was listed as an accident, but it wasn't. Ruth finished for him, the certainty she'd carried for 3 years finally spoken aloud. The axle on that wagon was new. Samuel checked every inch of our equipment weekly. He wouldn't have missed a flaw that severe. A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the soft clatter of dishes as Grace arranged them on the shelf. Why did you help us? Ethan asked, echoing his question from days earlier. Ruth crossed to the fireplace, stoking the flames higher against the gathering dusk. Because it was the right thing to do, she said simply. Then after a pause, and because I've been alone with my suspicions for 3 years, perhaps it's time they saw the light of day. Later that evening, as Grace slept and Ethan dozed by the fire, Ruth found herself drawn to the trunk at the foot of her bed. Samuel's trunk, which she hadn't opened since his funeral. With trembling hands, she lifted the lid, releasing the faint scent of tobacco and pine soap, Samuel's scent. Inside lay his belongings, the pocket watch that had been his father's, the Bible with pressed wildflowers marking favorite passages, the journal he'd kept since their wedding day. Ruth lifted out the leather-bound book, running her fingers over the worn cover. She'd never read it, feeling it would somehow violate the privacy he'd maintained even in marriage. But now, with danger circling Harper's Hollow like wolves around a wounded deer, she needed to know what secrets Samuel might have uncovered. The journal entries were brief, practical at first: weather conditions, crop yields, livestock records. But as Ruth turned the pages, moving closer to the date of his death, Samuel's observations took on a different tone. April 15, 1880, spoke with James Miller today. Claims surveyors moved his north boundary marker 50 yards south, putting his best grazing land suddenly on unclaimed territory. By nightfall, Montgomery's men had fenced it off. Law won't help, new deeds already filed with county records. April 29, 1880, found original survey maps in town hall archives. Compared to new railroad surveys, discrepancies everywhere. Montgomery's name on too many deeds to be coincidence. May 3, 1880, met EF from governor's office in secret today. Shared my findings. He agrees something is wrong, will continue to gather evidence. Ruth's hands stilled. EF. Ethan Foster. Had Samuel and Ethan actually met before? The final entry, dated May 10, 1880, 3 days before Samuel's death, sent a chill through her. M knows I'm asking questions. Threatened today, not directly, but message clear. Haven't told Ruth, no need for her to worry. Hidden documents in the usual place. If anything happens, EF will know what to do. God protect my Ruth if I cannot. A sound at the bedroom door startled her. Ethan stood there, leaning heavily against the frame, his face grim in the lamplight. You knew my husband, Ruth said, holding up the journal. You met with him before he died. Ethan nodded slowly. I did, once. He moved into the room, each step careful against his healing wound. Samuel found discrepancies in land records that matched patterns I'd seen elsewhere along the railroad route. He was gathering evidence, planning to testify before the Territorial Commission. He never mentioned you, Ruth said, a hint of accusation in her voice. He was protecting you, Ethan replied gently. The less you knew, the safer you would be if... He didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. Ruth closed the journal, clutching it to her chest. He mentions documents hidden in the usual place. Do you know what he meant? Ethan shook his head. He said he had proof papers, altered deeds, original survey maps, but he never told me where he kept them. A memory surfaced in Ruth's mind. Samuel disappearing into the barn late at night, returning with dirt on his hands, reassuring her it was nothing when she questioned him. I might, she said softly, I might know where to look. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Ruth rose early, her mind made up. If Samuel had evidence that could expose Montgomery's crimes, evidence worth killing for, she needed to find it. For 3 years she'd lived in limbo, neither accepting Samuel's death nor fighting against the injustice of it. It was time to honor her husband's courage with her own. She found Ethan at the kitchen table, his color improved, strength returning. Grace sat beside him, carefully slicing bread for breakfast. We need to search the barn, Ruth announced without preamble. Samuel had a hiding place there under the floorboards in the tack room. Ethan nodded, understanding immediately. Montgomery's men will be back. We don't have much time. They waited until midday, when the sun had warmed the air enough to make the journey to the barn less arduous for Ethan. Ruth led them to the small room where saddles and harnesses hung on pegs along the wall. She pointed to a section of flooring near the back corner. There, she said. He'd disappear in here sometimes, come back with dirt on his hands. Together they moved aside a heavy wooden chest, revealing floorboards that looked no different from the others. But when Ruth pressed on one particular board, it gave slightly. Here, she said, excitement rising in her voice. Ethan knelt beside her, wincing at the pull on his wound, and helped her pry up the board. Beneath it lay a shallow space dug into the earth, and within it, an oilskin-wrapped package. Ruth's hands trembled as she lifted it out. Unwrapping the oilskin revealed a tin box, the kind used for storing tobacco. Inside, they found exactly what Samuel had promised: survey maps with original boundaries marked in one color, altered boundaries in another. Copies of deeds with signatures that didn't match the originals. A list of names, families who had lost land through mysterious legal proceedings. And at the bottom, a sealed envelope addressed to the territorial governor, dated the day before Samuel died. This is it, Ethan breathed, scanning the documents. This is everything we need to bring Montgomery down. Ruth stared at her husband's handwriting, feeling both vindicated and hollowed out. 3 years she'd lived with the unspoken knowledge that Samuel's death was no accident. Now holding proof in her hands, she found the victory tasted like ash. "What do we do now?" she asked. Before Ethan could answer, Grace's voice called from outside. "Papa Ryder's coming." They hastily replaced the floorboard and moved the chest back into position. By the time they emerged from the barn, 3 men on horseback were approaching the house. Ruth recognized the lead rider immediately as Sheriff Davis. "Inside quickly," she urged Ethan and Grace. "Let me handle this." She met the riders in the yard, her posture straight-faced, composed despite the fear coursing through her veins. Beside the sheriff rode 2 men she recognized as Montgomery's employees, Jacob Turner, who managed the bank, and William Reed, the railroad company's local representative. "Sheriff," Ruth greeted, nodding coolly. "Gentlemen, what brings you to Harper's Hollow?" Davis dismounted, removing his hat. His expression was grim, apologetic. "Ruth, I need to speak with your guest." "I don't recall mentioning any guest, Sheriff." "Please don't make this difficult," Davis said quietly. "We know Ethan Foster is here. Mr. Montgomery has filed formal charges against him for theft of private documents and trespassing on railroad property." "Convenient charges," Ruth remarked, "especially for a man whose own dealings might not withstand legal scrutiny." Turner dismounted, his hand resting purposefully on the pistol at his hip. "Mrs. Calloway, we have no quarrel with you, but Foster is coming with us one way or another." The door to the house opened, and Ethan stepped out, his stance steady despite his recent injury. "I'm here, Sheriff. No need to threaten Mrs. Calloway." Davis looked uncomfortable. "Ethan Foster, I'm placing you under arrest on charges of theft and trespassing. You'll be held in Ironwood until the circuit judge arrives next week." "And how long will I live in that cell, Sheriff?" Ethan asked calmly. "Long enough for an accident to befall me," Reed laughed, a harsh sound in the quiet afternoon. "Now, why would anyone want to harm a simple thief?" "Perhaps because he's not a thief at all," Ruth interjected, moving to stand beside Ethan. "Perhaps because he's a federal investigator with evidence of fraud that could send certain prominent citizens to prison." Davis's gaze shifted between them, and Ruth saw the conflict in his eyes. He was a decent man at heart, she believed, but a man with pressures of his own. "The law is the law, Ruth," he said finally. "I have to take him in." "Then you'll take me too," she declared. "I'm harboring him willingly. I'm equally guilty." "No," Ethan said firmly. "You stay here with Grace." He turned to Davis. "Sheriff, I'll come peacefully on one condition: your personal guarantee of safety for Mrs. Calloway and my daughter. No one from Montgomery's camp sets foot on this property while I'm gone." Davis nodded. "You have my word." As Ethan was led to a horse, Grace burst from the house, running to her father's side. "Papa, no!" Ethan knelt, grimacing with the effort, and took her small face in his hands. "Be brave for me, little one. Stay with Mrs. Calloway. I'll be back soon." Tears streamed down Grace's face as she watched her father being led away. Ruth put an arm around the girl's shoulders, holding her close as the riders disappeared down the snow-covered lane. "He'll be all right," Ruth said, praying her words were true. "The sheriff is a good man." "But the others aren't," Grace replied, wisdom beyond her years sharpening her voice. "The bad men always find a way." That night, after Grace had finally fallen into exhausted sleep, Ruth sat by the fire, Samuel's journal open in her lap. She reread his final entries, searching for anything that might help Ethan, any details Samuel might have left that could expose Montgomery's schemes. A floorboard creaked, and Ruth looked up to find Grace standing in the doorway, her small face solemn in the firelight. "You should be sleeping," Ruth said gently. "I heard them talking," Grace said, moving to sit beside Ruth. "Before they took Papa, the man with the fancy coat said something about finishing what they started at the Ross place." Ruth frowned. "The Ross place? You're sure that's what he said?" Grace nodded. "What does it mean?" Ruth's mind raced. The Ross homestead lay abandoned 5 miles east of Harper's Hollow, or at least that's what everyone believed. Thomas Ross and his family had supposedly moved to Oregon 2 years ago, selling their land to Montgomery's company before departing. "It might be nothing," Ruth said, not wanting to frighten the child. "Try to sleep now. Tomorrow we'll figure out how to help your father." But after Grace returned to bed, Ruth couldn't shake the feeling that the Ross property held significance. Samuel had mentioned the Ross family in his journal, how their departure had seemed sudden, unexpected. He'd been suspicious then, and now Ruth found those suspicions rekindling. She made her decision before dawn. With Grace still sleeping, Ruth penned a quick note and left it on the kitchen table. Then she saddled her horse and rode east toward the Ross homestead as the first pale light of morning crept across the Wyoming plains. The Ross place stood silent and weathered its windows, dark barn door hanging askew on broken hinges. No one had lived here for 2 years yet. As Ruth approached, she noticed fresh tracks in the snow leading to the barn. Tethering her horse behind a stand of trees, Ruth approached cautiously, Samuel's pistol tucked into her coat pocket. The barn door slid open with a groan that seemed to echo across the empty landscape. Inside, weak winter sunlight filtered through gaps in the roof, illuminating a space that should have been empty. Instead, Ruth found herself staring at stacks of crates and barrels. Moving closer, she saw they contained surveying equipment, map cases, and boxes of documents. In one corner stood a desk where papers lay scattered as if someone had been working there recently. Ruth examined the map's detailed surveys of the entire county, with properties marked and coded. Harper's Hollow was circled in red with a note scrawled beside it, acquisition necessary before June 1st deadline. A sound outside made her freeze. Voices approaching, men's voices rough with the cold morning air. Ruth quickly gathered several maps and folded them inside her coat. She had just slipped behind a stack of crates when the barn door slid open. "Can't keep stalling," a voice was saying. "William Reed, the railroad representative. Montgomery wants that land secured before the Territorial Commission meets next month. Calloway's woman is as stubborn as her husband was," another voice replied, Jacob Turner. "Maybe we need to help her understand the situation more clearly." "No more accidents," Reed cautioned. "The governor's already asking questions about Foster. We need to be smarter this time." "Foster won't be a problem much longer," Turner said confidently. "Davis can't protect him forever. And once he's gone, the widow Calloway will have no choice but to sell. No one else knows what's beneath that worthless ranch of hers." Ruth's breath caught. Beneath her ranch. What were they talking about? "The coal seam is the biggest in the territory," Reed continued, moving papers on the desk. "The railroad will pay 10 times the land value once we secure the mining rights." Coal. There was coal under Harper's Hollow, valuable enough that Montgomery had killed Samuel to get it, and now aimed to eliminate Ethan as well. Ruth backed further into the shadows as the men continued working, discussing dates and documents. She needed to get this information to Ethan, to the sheriff, to anyone who might help stop what was coming. An hour passed before the men finally left, riding west toward Ironwood. Ruth waited until she could no longer hear hoofbeats before emerging from her hiding place. She gathered more papers, anything that looked important, and stuffed them into her saddlebags. As she mounted her horse to leave, a movement caught her eye, a rider approaching from the north, moving fast. Ruth urged her horse into the shelter of the trees, watching as the newcomer arrived at the barn. The man dismounted smoothly, his movements suggesting a comfort with violence that made Ruth's skin prickle with warning. He was tall, lean, dressed in dark clothes, with a gun belt worn low on his hips, a gunslinger's stance. He entered the barn, stayed only moments, then emerged, looking around carefully, as if sensing he wasn't alone. Ruth held her breath as his gaze swept across the tree line where she hid. After a long moment, he mounted his horse and rode off in the direction of Ironwood, his back straight, alert. She waited until he was well out of sight before guiding her horse onto the trail back to Harper's Hollow, her mind racing with what she'd discovered. Samuel had been right all along. Montgomery wasn't just stealing land, he was systematically acquiring properties along a coal seam that could make him one of the richest men in the territory. And now Ethan was in his custody, with only Sheriff Davis standing between him and whatever accident Montgomery had planned. Ruth rode hard, the winter sun climbing higher in the sky as she pushed her horse homeward. She needed to hide the evidence, then find a way to reach Ethan before it was too late. But as Harper's Hollow came into view, Ruth's blood turned to ice. Black smoke rose from behind her house, thick and ominous against the clear blue sky. The barn was burning. Ruth's heart hammered against her ribs as she urged her horse faster toward the billowing smoke. The acrid smell grew stronger with each pounding hoofbeat, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of kerosene. This was no accident. As she crested the final rise, the full devastation came into view. Flames engulfed the barn, its weathered timbers crackling and splitting in the intense heat. The fire had already consumed half the structure, hungry tongues of orange and red reaching skyward, as if determined to devour even the winter clouds above. "Grace!" Ruth's cry tore from her throat as she frantically scanned the yard for any sign of the child. The house still stood untouched, but the barn where Samuel's evidence had been hidden, was nearly gone. She dismounted before her horse had fully stopped stumbling toward the house. The front door burst open, and Grace ran out, her small face streaked with soot and tears. "They came back," the girl cried, flinging herself into Ruth's arms. "3 men with masks. They poured something on the barn and lit it. I hid in the cellar like Papa taught me." Relief flooded through Ruth as she held the trembling child. "You did right, Grace. You did exactly right." She looked back at the inferno that had once been her barn. "Did they go into the house? Did they look for anything?" Grace shook her head. "Just the barn. They said—" She hesitated, her young face screwed up with the effort of remembering. "They said to make sure nothing survived." Then they laughed. Montgomery's men, without question. They'd come for the evidence, knowing exactly where Samuel had hidden it. But how only she and Ethan had known about the hiding place beneath the floorboards. Unless— A cold realization settled in Ruth's stomach. Sheriff Davis had given his word that Montgomery's men wouldn't trouble her while Ethan was in custody. Either the sheriff's word meant nothing, or Montgomery's reach extended further than they'd imagined. Ruth guided Grace inside, keeping the girl away from the windows, as she quickly gathered the documents she'd taken from the Ross property. The evidence from Samuel's hiding place was lost, but these papers might still be enough to expose Montgomery's schemes if she could get them to someone who would listen. "We need to leave," Ruth said, stuffing the papers into a leather satchel. "It's not safe here anymore." Grace watched her with those unnervingly steady eyes. "Where will we go?" It was a question Ruth had been asking herself since seeing the smoke. They couldn't go to town. Montgomery's influence was too strong there. They couldn't stay at Harper's Hollow. The men would return once they realized she hadn't been home during their visit. "To someone I think we can trust," Ruth said, finally grabbing blankets and what little food could be quickly packed. "Someone who knew your father." The old blacksmith's shop sat at the edge of Ironwood, far enough from the main street to afford some privacy, close enough to be considered part of the town. Wesley Cooper had been a fixture in the community for decades, his skilled hands crafting everything from horseshoes to hinges. More importantly, he'd served with Samuel in the war and had been one of the few to openly question the circumstances of his friend's death. Ruth approached cautiously, leading her horse through the gathering dusk, with Grace huddled before her in the saddle. Light glowed from the forge, and the rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil told her Wesley was still at work despite the late hour. The hammering stopped as they drew near. Wesley emerged from the shop, wiping his hands on his leather apron, squinting into the fading light. "Who goes there?" he called, his voice gruff with age and the perpetual smoke of his forge. "It's Ruth Calloway Wesley," she answered, stepping into the circle of light cast by the shop's open door. "I need your help." Recognition dawned on the old blacksmith's weathered face, followed quickly by concern. "Ruth, what in tarnation are you doing in town after dark? And who's this little one?" "This is Grace," Ruth said, helping the girl down from the saddle. "Her father's been arrested, Ethan Foster." Wesley's bushy eyebrows shot up. "The fellow they're saying stole from the railroad company." He ushered them inside, casting a wary glance at the street beyond. "You'd best come in. Ears everywhere these days." Inside, the forge's heat was a welcome respite from the winter chill. Wesley closed and barred the door behind them, then gestured to a small room beyond the main shop where a modest living area had been established. "Sit, both of you," he said, pouring coffee for Ruth and finding a cup of milk for Grace. "Now tell me what's happened." Ruth explained everything: Ethan's arrival at Harper's Hollow, his connection to Samuel, the evidence they'd found, and finally the burning of her barn. Wesley listened in silence, his face growing grimmer with each revelation. "Cole," he said when she'd finished, shaking his head. "Should have guessed it was something like that. Montgomery's been buying up land all through the county, always claiming it's for the railroad, but a man doesn't kill for right-of-way alone." "You believe me then?" Ruth asked. "About Samuel's death not being an accident?" Wesley's eyes faded blue beneath bristling white brows held hers steadily. "Never thought it was girl. Sam was too careful with his equipment, and he'd been asking questions, dangerous questions." "Then you'll help us get Ethan out of jail. He has a better chance than anyone of getting this evidence to the governor." The old man sighed heavily. Ain't that simple, Ruth? Montgomery's got men watching the jail. Davis is doing what he can to keep Foster safe, but his hands are tied in many ways. What do you mean? Wesley hesitated, then said, Sheriff's boy, young Franklin, is studying medicine back east. Expensive schooling. Montgomery's been helping with the costs. Ruth's heart sank. He's bought the sheriff. Not bought, Wesley corrected. Leveraged. Davis is a good man at heart, but a father will do desperate things for his child. He ran a gnarled hand through his thinning white hair. There's something else you should know. Montgomery's brought in outside help, a gunslinger named Silas Turner. Grace, who had been quietly sipping her milk, suddenly looked up. The tall man with the black coat, I saw him at the jailhouse when they took Papa away. Wesley nodded gravely. That's him. Cold as Wyoming steel, that one. Rumor says he's killed a dozen men, maybe more. Never stands trial because his victims are always found with guns in their hands, self-defense, he claims. And Montgomery hired him to do what exactly, Ruth asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. To make sure Ethan Foster never testifies before the Territorial Commission, Wesley said simply. And I reckon to finish whatever business is left at Harper's Hollow after that. Ruth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter night. She'd known Montgomery was dangerous, but the calculated malice of bringing in a professional killer spoke of a desperation she hadn't anticipated. The coal beneath her land must be worth far more than she'd imagined. We need a plan, she said, squaring her shoulders. I have documents from the Ross property surveys showing the coal seam notes about the deadline for acquisition of my land. It's not everything, but it might be enough if we can get it to the right people. Wesley considered this. The circuit judge arrives next week. Montgomery's likely planning for Foster to have an accident before then. He paused, thinking. But there's another route. The territorial governor's representative is in Cheyenne right now, just 2 days' ride from here. I can't leave Grace, Ruth said, glancing at the child. She'll be safe here with me, Wesley assured her. No one looks twice at an old blacksmith minding his granddaughter. He smiled kindly at Grace. What do you say, little Miss Care, to learn how to shoe a horse while your pa's friend goes for help? Grace studied him with that penetrating gaze that seemed to look straight through adult pretenses. You knew my papa's friend, Mr. Calloway. Sure did, Wesley said, softening. Served with him in the war. He saved my life at Antietam, carried me half a mile with a bullet in his own leg. Grace nodded solemnly. Then I'll stay with you, but Mrs. Calloway has to promise to help Papa. I promise, Ruth said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. In the short time she'd known Ethan and Grace, they had awakened something she'd thought died with Samuel, a sense of purpose, of connection to something beyond mere survival. Then it's settled, Wesley said. You'll leave before dawn. There's an old hunting trail that skirts the main road, keeps you out of sight until you're well past Ironwood. I'll draw you a map. As Wesley busied himself with preparations, Ruth sat beside Grace on the small cot that would be her bed for the night. Your father is a brave man, she said softly. Samuel would have liked him very much. Grace leaned against her, the child's warmth a comfort in the uncertain night. Papa says courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right even when you're scared. Ruth smiled, hearing Ethan's thoughtful nature in his daughter's words. That sounds like something Samuel used to say. Were you a nurse in the war too? Grace asked. Like you told Papa. I was, Ruth nodded. That's how I met Samuel. I tended to him after he was wounded at Gettysburg. Is that why you're helping us? Because you're a nurse and Papa was hurt? Ruth considered the question, its simplicity belying its depth. Partly, she admitted, but also because it's what Samuel would have done. And because sometimes Grace life gives us a second chance to do what's right. The child nodded as if this made perfect sense, then yawned widely. Ruth tucked the blankets around her, marveling at the resilience of the young. Despite everything Grace had endured, losing her mother, witnessing violence against her father, being uprooted and hunted, she maintained a core of strength that many adults would envy. As Grace drifted towards sleep, Ruth joined Wesley at his small table where he was sketching a crude map by lamplight. You'll need to travel light and fast, he said without looking up. Take the north trail here, then cut east along the ridge. Keeps you high enough to spot anyone following. What about Ethan? Ruth asked, lowering her voice. We can't just leave him in that jail with Turner lurking about. Wesley's hands stilled on the paper. I've been thinking on that. Davis keeps the jail keys on him at all times, but he's got a weakness for checkers at the Ironwood Saloon most evenings. Gives his deputy time alone at the office. He glanced up, a glint in his eye. Deputy Jenkins is sweet on Mildred Palmer's daughter, Sophia. Visits her every night around 9, leaving the office empty for a good 20 minutes. Ruth raised an eyebrow. You seem remarkably well informed about the sheriff's office routines. A ghost of a smile crossed the old man's face. When you're my age, people stop noticing you're there. Makes it easy to observe things not meant for public knowledge. So I could get in while the deputy is out courting, Ruth said, thinking aloud. But what about Montgomery's men watching the jail? That's where I come in, Wesley said. There's a delivery of new hinges due for the jailhouse tomorrow. Ordered special from my shop. I'll make the delivery myself, take my time about it, make sure everything's installed just right. And create a distraction, Ruth finished, understanding dawning. Wesley nodded. Old men like me are prone to accidents. Might drop a whole box of tools right when the deputy leaves for his nightly visit. The kind of commotion that draws attention away from the back door, if you take my meaning. Ruth felt a surge of gratitude for this gruff old warrior who'd maintained his loyalty to Samuel even after death. Montgomery will know it was you who helped us. Let him, Wesley shrugged. What's he going to do, kill an old man who served in the war? Even Montgomery has to keep up appearances. His expression turned serious. But Ruth, once Foster is free, you both need to get clear of Ironwood immediately. Head straight for Cheyenne. Don't stop for anything. Ruth nodded, the weight of tomorrow's task settling on her shoulders. So much could go wrong. If they were caught, Montgomery would have all the justification he needed to eliminate them, both a widow aiding a prisoner's escape, both with stolen documents in their possession. Yet what choice did they have? Without intervention, Ethan would be dead within days, another accident that everyone would whisper about but no one would challenge. And then Montgomery would turn his attention to Harper's Hollow and the coal beneath it, with only a widow and a child standing in his way. Get some rest, Wesley advised, seeing the worry in her eyes. Tomorrow will test us all. But sleep proved elusive for Ruth that night. She lay on Wesley's spare cot, listening to the occasional hiss of the banked forge and Grace's soft breathing, her mind racing through all that had transpired since the night Ethan Foster had appeared in her barn. In just a few days, her carefully constructed isolation had been shattered. After Samuel's death, she'd withdrawn from the world, focusing solely on maintaining the land he'd loved. Her grief had become a shelter of sorts, a way to avoid the pain of connection, the risk of further loss. Now she found herself not only connected, but committed to a dangerous path that could cost her everything, the land, her freedom, perhaps even her life. And yet, for the first time in 3 years, she felt truly alive. The numbness that had encased her heart since Samuel's death was giving way to something else, determination, purpose, and perhaps, though she scarcely dared admit it, the first fragile tendrils of hope. Dawn arrived with a hesitant glow that barely penetrated the low winter clouds. Ruth had been awake for hours reviewing the plan, with Wesley memorizing the map to Cheyenne and preparing for every contingency they could imagine. Remember, Wesley said as he helped her saddle a fresh horse from his small stable. 9 o'clock, not before. Jenkins is punctual about his courting. Ruth nodded, securing her saddlebags. Inside were the documents from the Ross property, along with provisions for the journey to Cheyenne. I'll be ready. Grace appeared in the stable doorway, clutching a small bundle. Mrs. Calloway, she said solemnly, I made something for Papa. She held out a rough scarf, unevenly knitted, but clearly made with great care. Can you give it to him? It gets cold in the jail. Ruth knelt, taking the scarf and folding it carefully into her coat. I will, Grace, and soon he'll be well enough to thank you himself. The girl nodded, her faith in this outcome so complete that Ruth felt her own resolve strengthen. They would succeed. They had to. The day passed with excruciating slowness. Ruth remained hidden in Wesley's back room, watching through a small window as the town of Ironwood went about its business, unaware of the conspiracy being planned in their midst. She saw Montgomery himself at one point, emerging from the bank. He owned his expensive coat and confident stride, marking him as a man accustomed to power and deference. It was strange to look upon the face of the man who had orchestrated Samuel's death, who even now was planning Ethan's. He appeared so ordinary, so human, not the monster she had imagined. This made him all the more dangerous in Ruth's eyes. Evil rarely announced itself with horns and fangs. It came with a smile and a handshake, with reasonable words masking unreasonable desires. As dusk settled over Ironwood, Wesley returned from his shop, bringing word that all was prepared. He would leave with his wagon of tools and hinges just before 9, timing his arrival at the jailhouse to coincide with Deputy Jenkins' departure. "Davis is at the saloon already," Wesley reported. "Saw him start his checkers game with Judge Harmon. He'll be occupied for at least 2 hours." Ruth checked her pocket watch, Samuel's watch, which she had taken to carrying after his death. 8:30. Almost time. "How will I know if if he's still able to travel?" she asked, voicing the fear that had gnawed at her throughout the day. "What if Montgomery's men had already gotten to him? Davis is keeping him in the back cell away from other prisoners," Wesley assured her. "And he's checking the food himself before it goes to Foster. He may be compromised, but he's not a murderer." Ruth took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Very well, I'd best get into position." Wesley clasped her shoulder with a strong, calloused hand. "Samuel would be proud of you, girl. Never doubt that." Ruth blinked back unexpected tears. "Take care of Grace. If we don't return—" "Don't talk that way," the old man interrupted. "You'll both be back with that evidence, and Montgomery will finally answer for what he's done." Ruth nodded, forcing confidence into her bearing. She embraced Grace, promising to return with her father, then slipped out into the night, keeping to the shadows, as she made her way toward the jailhouse at the center of town. Ironwood's main street was relatively quiet for the evening hour. Most activities centered around the saloon, where light and music spilled onto the boardwalk. Ruth skirted the edge of town, using alleys and back passages to approach the jailhouse from behind. She positioned herself in the shadows of a storage shed across from the jail's rear entrance, watching as a young Deputy Jenkins presumably emerged precisely at 9 o'clock. He straightened his vest, ran a hand through his hair, and strode purposefully in the direction of the Palmer residence. Right on schedule, Wesley's wagon appeared on the main street. The old blacksmith made a show of unloading his tools, calling out a greeting to the few passers-by still about. Ruth counted the minutes, waiting for the signal. It came with a tremendous crash, Wesley's entire box of tools spilling across the jailhouse steps, accompanied by his colorful cursing that drew attention from every direction. 2 men who had been loitering near the jail's front entrance moved to help, momentarily abandoning their watch. This was her chance. Ruth darted across the open space to the jail's back door. Wesley had assured her it would be unlocked. Part of his preparations earlier in the day had included adjusting the lock so it wouldn't catch properly. The door opened with a soft creak. Ruth slipped inside, finding herself in a narrow corridor lit by a single wall-mounted lamp. 3 cells lined the back wall. 2 were empty. In the third, a figure sat hunched on a narrow cot. "Ethan," Ruth whispered, approaching the bars. He looked up, surprise and alarm crossing his face as he recognized her. "Ruth, what are you doing here?" He rose quickly, coming to the bars. "You shouldn't be here. It's too dangerous." "I'm getting you out," she said, scanning the wall where a ring of keys hung on a hook, just as Wesley had described. "Montgomery's brought in a gunslinger. You're not safe here." Ethan's expression darkened. "Silas Turner. I've seen him watching the jail." He gripped the bars. "But Ruth, if you do this, you'll be a fugitive too. You'll lose everything, the ranch, your standing, everything." "I've already lost the barn," she told him, testing keys in the lock. "Montgomery's men burned it this morning with all of Samuel's evidence inside." Ethan cursed softly. "And Grace, is she—" "Safe," Ruth assured him, "with Wesley Cooper. He's creating a distraction out front right now, but we don't have much time." The third key turned in the lock. The cell door swung open with a metallic groan that seemed deafening in the quiet building. Ethan stepped out, moving stiffly, evidence of rough handling since his arrest. "There's a fresh horse waiting behind Wesley's shop," Ruth said, leading the way back to the door. "We'll ride for Cheyenne tonight. I have documents from the Ross property surveys of the coal seam, notes about Montgomery's plans. It's not everything, but it might be enough," Ethan finished, hope kindling in his eyes. "Ruth, I don't know how to thank you." "Thank me when we're safely in Cheyenne," she replied. "Right now we need to—" The rear door burst open. Deputy Jenkins stood framed in the doorway, his young face registering shock, then anger, as he took in the scene before him. "Mrs. Calloway," he gasped, reaching for his gun. Step away from the prisoner. Ethan moved with surprising speed for an injured man. He lunged forward, catching the deputy's arm before he could draw his weapon. They grappled briefly before Ethan landed a solid blow that sent Jenkins staggering back against the wall. "I'm sorry about that," Ethan said grimly as the young man slumped unconscious to the floor. "He seems like a decent sort." "He'll have a headache, but he'll live," Ruth said, checking the deputy's pulse. "Which is more than we will if we don't leave now." They slipped out the back door, keeping to the shadows as they circled around the edge of town toward Wesley's blacksmith shop. The commotion from the front of the jailhouse had died down, which meant Wesley had concluded his distraction. Soon someone would check on the prisoner and raise the alarm. As they approached the shop, a figure detached itself from the shadows beside the door. Ruth tensed, reaching for the small pistol in her coat pocket, but Ethan laid a restraining hand on her arm. "It's Wesley," he said softly. The old blacksmith beckoned them urgently inside. "Hurry," he said as soon as the door was closed behind them. "Jenkins left his post early tonight. Sophia Palmer's mother caught them meeting last week. Raised a mighty fuss about propriety." "We know," Ruth said grimly. "He nearly caught us. Ethan had to subdue him." Wesley's bushy eyebrows shot up. "Then we have even less time than I thought. They'll be searching the town within minutes." He led them through the shop to the small stable behind where 2 horses stood saddled and ready. "Grace is asleep. Better that way, easier for her not to know exactly when you left." Ruth embraced the old man. "Thank you, Wesley, for everything." "Just get that evidence to Cheyenne," he replied gruffly. "And when this is over, bring that little girl back here. She's got a knack for the forge, believe it or not. Helped me shape a horseshoe this afternoon." Ethan clasped Wesley's hand. "We'll return," he promised, "and Montgomery will answer for what he's done to all of us." They mounted quickly, Wesley holding the stable door as they guided their horses out into the night. "Take the north trail," he reminded them. "It's longer, but safer. Good luck." The sound of shouting reached them from the direction of the jailhouse. The alarm had been raised. Without another word, Ruth and Ethan urged their horses into motion, keeping to back alleys until they reached the edge of town, then breaking into a gallop as they headed north toward the ridge that would lead them to Cheyenne. They rode hard for an hour, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Ironwood before the inevitable pursuit began. The night was clear, stars pricking the black canopy above like pinpricks in velvet, the moon providing just enough light to navigate the trail Wesley had described. When they finally stopped to rest the horses, they had reached the ridge that overlooked the valley where Ironwood nestled. In the distance, lights moved along the main road leading out of town, searchers already on their trail. "They're taking the direct route to Cheyenne," Ethan observed. "They don't know about this trail." "Not yet," Ruth agreed, "but by morning they'll have figured it out. We need to keep moving." As they prepared to mount again, Ethan caught her arm. "Ruth," he said, his voice low and urgent in the darkness, "you should know there's something I haven't told you about why I came to Harper's Hollow specifically." Ruth tensed. "What do you mean?" In the pale moonlight, she could see the conflict in his face. "I knew Samuel," he admitted, "not just through his letters to the governor's office. We served together briefly during the war." Ruth stared at him, pieces falling into place. "You were the one who saved him at Gettysburg," she whispered. "The stranger who bound his wounds." Ethan nodded. "We lost touch after the war. But when his letters reached the governor describing the land fraud in Ironwood, I recognized his name immediately. I volunteered to investigate." He took a deep breath. "When Samuel died, I suspected it wasn't an accident. I was already building a case against Montgomery for similar schemes elsewhere near along the railroad road, but I couldn't prove the connection to Samuel's death." "So you came to Harper's Hollow looking for his evidence," Ruth said, understanding dawning. "That's why you were shot. Montgomery's men discovered you were investigating Samuel's death specifically." "Well, yes," Ethan admitted, "but there's more. Before he died, Samuel sent me one last letter. He said if anything happened to him, I should find his widow, that you would have the key to exposing Montgomery, though you might not know it." Ruth's mind raced. The key. What key? Samuel had hidden documents, yes, but nothing that would qualify as a key to the entire conspiracy. "I don't understand," she said. "I've lived at Harper's Hollow for 3 years since Samuel's death. If there was some key, some vital piece of evidence, I would have found it." Ethan shook his head. "I don't know what he meant either, but Samuel was deliberate in his choice of words. Whatever this key is, he believed it was something only you would recognize or understand. The sound of distant hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. The searchers were changing course, moving toward the trail that led to the ridge. "We need to go," Ruth said, pushing aside the new questions Ethan's revelation had raised. "We can figure out Samuel's riddle later." They rode through the night, pushing their mounts as hard as they dared on the unfamiliar trail. The terrain grew rougher as they climbed higher into the foothills, the path narrowing until they were forced to ride single file. Dawn found them deep in the wilderness that separated Ironwood from Cheyenne and country Ruth had never traversed. They paused briefly at a small stream to water the horses and gulp down cold biscuits Wesley had packed for their journey. "How much farther to Cheyenne?" Ruth asked, consulting the crude map. "Another day's ride," Ethan estimated, "if we push hard and the weather holds." The sky was clear for now, but in Wyoming territory, winter storms could gather with frightening speed. Already Ruth could see clouds building on the western horizon, a sign that their window of good weather might be closing. "We should keep moving," she said, rising stiffly from her brief rest. "Those clouds look troubling." They mounted again, continuing along the ridge trail that wound through stands of pine and across rocky clearings. As they rode, Ruth found her thoughts returning to Ethan's revelation. Samuel had believed she possessed some key to exposing Montgomery's crimes, something important enough that he'd mentioned it in his final letter to Ethan. What could it be? She'd gone through Samuel's belongings after his death, finding nothing unusual. His journal had contained the observations about the land fraud, yes, but nothing that would qualify as a definitive key to proving Montgomery's guilt. Unless a memory surfaced, Samuel returning late one night shortly before his death, mud on his boots despite the dry weather, a strange expression on his face when she'd questioned him. "Just checking fence lines," he'd said, though his eyes had held a secret she hadn't pressed him to reveal. The next morning, he'd added a curious entry to his journal, "Visited the old oak today." Still standing after all these years. Some things endure even when we're gone. The old oak. Ruth knew it well, a massive tree that stood alone on a small rise near the eastern boundary of their property. Samuel had often spoken of it with unusual reverence, claiming his grandfather had rested beneath it when first surveying the land that would become Harper's Hollow. Could that be the location of the key Samuel had mentioned to Ethan? Had he hidden something there in those final days, something too important to keep in the house or barn? She was about to share this thought with Ethan when a sound stopped her. The crack of a rifle followed by the whine of a bullet passing entirely too close to her head. "Ambush!" Ethan shouted, spurring his horse forward as a second shot kicked up dirt at their feet. Ruth followed, hunching low over her mount's neck as they galloped across an exposed stretch of the trail. The shots had come from the rocks above them, a perfect position for an ambush. Montgomery's men had anticipated their route after all. They rode hard, zigzagging when possible to present more difficult targets. Two more shots rang out, but neither found its mark as Ruth and Ethan plunged into a dense stand of pines that offered temporary cover. "Keep going," Ethan called, dropping back slightly to guard their rear. "Don't stop," Ruth pressed forward, her heart pounding in rhythm with her horse's hooves. The trail narrowed further, winding precariously along the edge of a steep ravine. One misstep would send horse and rider plummeting to the rocks below. A rider appeared ahead, blocking the trail, a tall man on a black horse, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He sat motionless, waiting, one hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip. Ruth reined in sharply, her horse rearing in protest. Behind her, Ethan drew up his breath, coming hard as he assessed this new threat. "Silas Turner," he said, recognition and resignation mingling in his voice. The gunslinger tipped his hat slightly, his lean face expressionless. "Mr. Foster," he acknowledged. "Mrs. Calloway, you've led us on quite a chase." "Us?" Ruth questioned, scanning the surrounding trees for signs of other riders. "My employers are not far behind," Turner said calmly. "Mr. Montgomery was most distressed to learn of your departure from Ironwood. He sent me to escort you back." "To kill us, you mean?" Ethan said flatly. Something like amusement flickered in Turner's cold eyes. "Not immediately. Mr. Montgomery has questions about certain documents that appear to be missing from his property." Ruth's hand instinctively moved toward her saddlebag where the Ross property papers were hidden. Turner noticed the gesture, his gaze sharpening. "Yes, those would be the ones," he said. "I'll take them now, if you please." "And then what?" Ruth demanded. We peacefully return to Ironwood where more accidents await us. Turner shrugged the movement fluid and unconcerned. What happens in Ironwood is not my concern. My job is to retrieve the documents and return with you both. How Montgomery handles matters after that is his business. And if we refuse, Ethan asked, though the answer was obvious, given their position trapped on a narrow trail with gunmen behind and a deadly ravine to one side. Turner's hand moved to his pistol, the gesture unhurried yet unmistakable in its threat. Then I complete the second part of my assignment immediately rather than allowing Montgomery his questions. Ruth exchanged a glance with Ethan, seeing in his eyes the same calculation she was making. They couldn't outrun Turner, couldn't outfight him, and couldn't go back the way they'd come with Montgomery's other men closing in. The documents, she said slowly, reaching into her saddlebag. I'll give them to you. Ethan looked at her sharply, clearly surprised by her apparent surrender. But Ruth had noticed something. Turner had not a fork in the trail, just yards ahead, partially hidden by a stand of young pines. One branch continued along the ridge. The other descended steeply into the ravine, possibly offering an escape route if they could reach it. She withdrew the packet of papers, holding them up for Turner to see. His expression didn't change, but she detected a glint of satisfaction in his eyes as he extended his hand. A wise decision, Mrs. Calloway. Ruth nudged her horse forward slowly, as if to hand over the documents. As she drew alongside Turner, she suddenly flung the papers into his face and slapped his horse hard on the flank. The animal reared in surprise, momentarily throwing Turner off balance. Now, she shouted to Ethan, spurring her own mount toward the hidden fork. Ethan followed instantly, both of them galloping toward the narrow descent into the ravine. Behind them, Turner cursed and fought to control his horse, the scattered papers blowing away in the wind. The descent was treacherous, a steep, winding path, barely wide enough for a single rider. Ruth's horse picked its way down carefully, but quickly sensing its rider's urgency. Loose rocks clattered down the slope, raising tiny puffs of dust as they bounced toward the bottom. They were halfway down when Turner appeared at the top of the trail, his face now showing the first real emotion Ruth had seen: cold anger. He drew his pistol, taking careful aim despite the distance. The shot echoed off the ravine walls. Ruth felt her horse stumble, then recover. For a moment she thought Turner had missed, then she felt the warm wetness spreading across her left arm. The bullet had found her after all. Ruth, Ethan called from behind, seeing her sway in the saddle. Keep going, she gritted through clenched teeth, fighting to stay upright as pain radiated from the wound. They reached the bottom of the ravine, a narrow space through which a small stream ran between rocky banks. The terrain offered more cover here, boulder stands of pine, uneven ground that would make pursuit more difficult. Ethan caught up to Ruth, his face tight with concern as he saw the blood staining her sleeve. How bad? Just a graze, she lied, knowing it was worse, but unwilling to slow their escape. The papers, I had to use them as a distraction. We'll manage without them, Ethan assured her. Right now we need to find shelter and tend to that wound. They followed the stream, keeping to the cover of the trees along its banks. The ravine widened gradually, opening into a valley that stretched eastward. Behind them they could hear Turner beginning his descent of the treacherous trail, his horse's hooves sending cascades of small stones skittering down the slope. There, Ethan pointed to a dark opening in the rock face ahead, a small cave or overhang that might offer temporary shelter. They dismounted, leading their tired horses into the shadow of the rock formation. It was indeed a shallow cave, deep enough to conceal them and their mounts from casual observation, but with sufficient light from the entrance to see. Let me look at that arm, Ethan said as soon as they were settled. Ruth reluctantly removed her coat, wincing, as the movement sent fresh pain through her injured limb. The bullet had torn through the flesh of her upper arm, leaving an ugly furrow that bled steadily. Just a graze. Ethan said, raising an eyebrow as he examined the wound. Compared to being dead, yes, Ruth replied dryly. Ethan tore a strip from his own shirt, using it to bind the wound tightly. It needs proper cleaning, but this will have to do for now. His hands were gentle despite the urgency of their situation, his touch bringing an unexpected comfort. Thank you, Ruth said when he'd finished. For everything. I'm sorry about the documents. Ethan shook his head. You made the right call. Papers can be replaced, lives can't. He moved to the cave entrance, peering out cautiously. No sign of Turner yet, but he'll find us eventually. We need to keep moving once you're able. Ruth nodded, leaning back against the cool stone wall. The pain in her arm had settled into a steady throb, manageable but draining. She closed her eyes briefly, trying to gather her strength for the journey ahead. "When I was tending to your fever," she said after a moment, "you mentioned something in your sleep. You said schematics in the last survey. Do you remember what you were dreaming about?" Ethan turned from his watch at the entrance, his expression thoughtful. "Not dreaming, remembering." Hannah found engineering schematics for the railroad detailed plans, showing exactly where the tracks would run, where bridges and tunnels would be built. He moved to sit beside her. Those plans revealed something crucial. The railroad wasn't just planning a route through this territory, they were planning a major depot and coal loading facility, right on top of Harper's Hollow. Ruth's eyes widened. "That's why Montgomery is so desperate to acquire my land. It's not just the coal seam, it's the strategic location for their operations." "Exactly," Ethan nodded. "Your property sits at the perfect junction point, access to water from the creek, relatively flat terrain for building, and of course the coal beneath. Montgomery stands to make a fortune, not just from mining rights, but from controlling the entire transportation infrastructure." A cold realization settled over Ruth. "So even if we reach Cheyenne, even if we convince the governor's representative of Montgomery's crimes, it might not be enough to stop the railroad from taking Harper's Hollow." "Not through legal means," Ethan agreed grimly, "but it would be enough to bring Montgomery to justice for Samuel's death, and for Hannah's." The mention of Samuel brought Ruth's earlier thoughts rushing back. "Ethan, I think I might know what Samuel meant by the key he mentioned in his letter to you." She explained about the old oak tree and Samuel's curious behavior shortly before his death. "It's worth investigating," Ethan said, hope kindling in his eyes. "If we can get back to Harper's Hollow—" "Assuming we survive long enough to try," Ruth interjected, gesturing toward the cave entrance where shadows had begun to lengthen as afternoon waned. Ethan checked his pistol, ensuring it was loaded and ready. "We'll rest until dark, then continue east. If we can reach the main road to Cheyenne by morning, we might find help, a stage perhaps, or other travelers." Ruth nodded, though the prospect of more hard riding with her injured arm was daunting. "And if Turner finds us before then," Ethan's expression hardened, "then we'll deal with that when it happens." "But Ruth," he met her gaze directly, "I want you to know that whatever comes, I'm grateful. For your help, for your courage. Not many would risk what you have for a stranger." "You're not a stranger anymore," Ruth replied softly. "You're the man who saved my husband at Gettysburg, the man who's trying to bring his killer to justice. And she hesitated, then continued with quiet certainty, "the man who helped me remember what it feels like to fight for something that matters." Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the first few flakes of snow from the clouds that had been building all day. The storm they had feared was arriving, bringing both peril and possibility. In the wilderness, bad weather could kill, but it could also cover tracks, hide trails, and blind pursuers. As darkness fell, Ruth and Ethan prepared to venture out into the gathering storm, their futures as uncertain as the path ahead. But for the first time since Samuel's death, Ruth felt something beyond grief and isolation. In the midst of danger, she had found purpose. And perhaps, though she scarcely dared acknowledge it, something else as well, the fragile beginning of a connection she had believed forever lost to her. The question was whether they would live long enough to explore what that connection might become. The storm descended upon the valley with unforgiving fury. Wind howled through the ravine, driving snow in horizontal sheets that reduced visibility to mere feet. Ruth and Ethan huddled at the mouth of the cave, watching nature's wrath transform the landscape into a swirling, white void. "We can't travel in this," Ethan said, raising his voice above the wind's keening. "It would be suicide." Ruth nodded, cradling her injured arm. The pain had settled into a persistent throb, but the bleeding had mostly stopped thanks to Ethan's makeshift bandage. "Turner won't be able to track us either," she observed. "At least the storm works in our favor that way." They retreated deeper into the cave where the horses stood, with heads lowered, occasionally stomping against the cold stone floor. Ethan gathered what little deadwood had blown into the cave's entrance, arranging it carefully in a small depression in the rock. "We dare not make a large fire," he said, striking a match from the small tin he carried. "The smoke might give us away if Turner is nearby, but we need some warmth, especially with your injury." The tiny flame caught, growing slowly as Ethan fed it small twigs and dried pine needles. The meager fire cast dancing shadows on the cave walls, providing little heat but a measure of comfort against the howling darkness beyond. Ruth settled against the wall, watching Ethan's face in the wavering light. The events of the past days had etched new lines around his eyes, yet there was a steadiness to him that reminded her of Samuel, a quiet determination that adversity seemed to strengthen rather than diminish. "You should rest," he said, noticing her gaze. "I'll keep watch." "And who will watch while you sleep?" she countered. "You're still recovering from your own wound, Ethan. We'll take turns." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Stubborn woman. "Well, so Samuel often told me," she replied, returning the smile before her expression sobered. "Ethan, if we don't make it to Cheyenne, if something happens, I need to know Grace will be safe." "Wesley will protect her," Ethan assured her. "And if the worst happens, I've made arrangements. A family in Denver, friends of Hannah's. They would take Grace in, raise her as their own." The thought of Grace orphaned again passed to yet another guardian weighed heavily on Ruth's heart. The girl had already lost so much. "We will make it," she said with a conviction she didn't entirely feel. "We have to." As the night deepened, the storm's intensity only increased. Wind shrieked through crevices in the rock, finding its way into their shelter despite the protection of the cave. The temperature dropped steadily, the small fire providing barely enough heat to keep their immediate vicinity above freezing. Ruth insisted on taking first watch, allowing Ethan to curl up near the fire for a few hours of fitful sleep. Her arm throbbed in time with her heartbeat, and she found herself drifting in and out of awareness, despite her best efforts to remain alert. In those half-dreaming moments, memories surfaced with vivid clarity, Samuel showing her Harper's Hollow for the first time, his face alight with pride, as he described his vision for their future. The quiet evenings spent planning crops and improvements. The last morning she saw him alive, kissing her goodbye before riding into Ironwood, never to return. She hadn't allowed herself to dwell on these memories for years, finding the pain too acute. But now, in this cave with death perhaps only hours away, she found a bittersweet comfort in them. Samuel had lived fully, loved deeply, and died fighting for what he believed was right. If her own end came soon, she could at least say she'd done the same. "Ruth?" Ethan's voice pulled her from her reverie. He sat up, concern evident in his expression. "You should have woken me. It's been hours." "Had it?" Ruth blinked, disoriented. The fire had burned down to embers, and the quality of darkness beyond the cave mouth had shifted subtly, suggesting the deepest part of night had passed. "I'm fine," she said automatically, then winced as a particularly sharp pain lanced through her arm. Ethan moved to her side, gently checking the bandage. In the dim light, his frown was just visible as he examined the wound. "It's warm to the touch. There might be infection starting." Ruth nodded, unsurprised. Field medicine was never ideal, and the bullet had dragged clothing fibers into the wound. "We have no choice but to push on to Cheyenne once the storm breaks." The storm's intensity has lessened, Ethan observed, listening to the wind. "Dawn isn't far off. We should prepare to move." And they shared the last of Wesley's provisions, jerky and hard biscuits, that did little to satisfy hunger, but provided enough sustenance to continue. The horses accepted handfuls of oats from their saddlebags along with melted snow for water. As the faint light of dawn filtered through the lingering snowfall, they led their mounts from the cave. The world outside had been transformed. 6 inches of fresh snow blanketed the ground, smoothing the rugged terrain into gentle curves and hollows. The air was still, the storm having moved eastward, leaving behind a crystalline clarity that made the snow-covered landscape glitter in the growing light. "Beautiful," Ruth murmured, momentarily struck by the pristine scene before them. "And dangerous," Ethan added pragmatically. "We'll leave clear tracks." He was right, of course. Their passage would be obvious to anyone following. But the storm would have obliterated their earlier trail, meaning Turner would have to search the entire valley to find where they had sheltered. They mounted with difficulty, Ruth gritting her teeth against the pain as she pulled herself into the saddle. Ethan led the way, choosing a route that followed the frozen stream at the bottom of the ravine. The water's course would eventually lead them to lower elevations and hopefully to the main road to Cheyenne. They rode in silence, conserving energy and remaining alert for any sign of pursuit. The snow deadened sound, creating an eerie stillness, broken only by the crunch of their horses' hooves and the occasional distant crack of a snow-laden branch giving way. By midday, Ruth's condition had worsened. Fever flushed her cheeks despite the bitter cold, and she found herself struggling to maintain her seat. Ethan watched her with increasing concern, finally calling a halt in a small clearing sheltered by a stand of pines. "You need rest," he said as he helped her dismount. and that wound needs proper attention. Ruth didn't argue, a testament to how poorly she felt. Ethan cleared snow from a fallen log, helping her sit before examining her arm again. The bandage was soaked through with blood and fluid, and the flesh around the wound had taken on an angry red hue. "I've seen wounds like this in the war," Ethan said grimly. "Without treatment." He didn't finish the thought. Ruth met his gaze steadily. "How far to the main road?" "Another few hours' ride. From there, Cheyenne is still a day's journey. Time she might not have if the infection continued to spread." Ruth had tended enough wounded soldiers to know how quickly blood poisoning could take hold, how it could kill even the strongest men within days. "Then we keep moving," she said firmly. "As long as I can stay in the saddle, we continue." Ethan looked as if he wanted to argue, but instead nodded, helping her to her feet. As they prepared to mount again, he paused, head tilted, in the attitude of someone listening intently. "What is it?" Ruth asked, immediately alert. "Hoofbeats," he said quietly. "At least 2 riders coming from the west." They stood frozen, straining to hear above the soft whisper of wind through the pines. Then Ruth caught it too, the unmistakable rhythm of horses moving at a steady trot, the sound carrying clearly in the cold air. "Turner," she breathed. Ethan's expression hardened, and probably one of Montgomery's men with him. They must have started at first light following the ravine. Their own tracks would lead the pursuers directly to them. There was no time to find a hiding place. "We have to run for it," Ruth said, moving toward her horse despite the protest of her injured body. Ethan caught her arm, his grip gentle but firm. "You're in no condition for a hard ride, and they'd catch us anyway. Their horses are fresh." "What then?" Ruth demanded. "We can't just wait here for them." Ethan's eyes held a determination that sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the winter air. "I'll lead them away. You continue east to the main road." "No." The word burst from her with unexpected force. "I won't leave you to face them alone." "Ruth, listen to me," Ethan said urgently. "One of us has to reach Cheyenne with what we know. You have the best chance. I can buy you the time you need." "It's suicide," she protested. "Turner is a professional killer." A ghost of a smile touched Ethan's lips. "I've faced worse odds." He took her hand, pressing something cold and metal into her palm. "Take this." Ruth looked down to find Samuel's pocket watch in her hand, the one she'd carried since his death, the one she'd shown Ethan during their journey. "I don't understand." "Open it," Ethan said, his voice gentle despite the urgency of their situation. With trembling fingers, Ruth pressed the small catch that released the watch's cover. Inside, where there had once been only the watch face, she now saw a folded piece of paper wedged into the mechanism, stopping the hands at precisely 12 o'clock. "What is this?" she asked, carefully extracting the paper. "I found it when you lent me the watch to keep time during my watch last night," Ethan explained. "It was hidden behind the face. Samuel must have placed it there before he died." Ruth unfolded the paper with shaking hands. It was a small map drawn in Samuel's precise hand, showing Harper's Hollow and the surrounding properties. A section at the eastern boundary was marked with an X with a notation beside it: "Original survey markers. Proof of fraud." "The key," Ruth whispered, understanding dawning. "Samuel hid the original boundary markers to prove the surveys had been altered." Ethan nodded. "Your husband was clever. He knew Montgomery's men would search the house, the barn, anywhere obvious. But a watch carried by his widow that they wouldn't think to check." The hoofbeats grew louder, perhaps a quarter-mile away now. There was no more time for discussion. "Go," Ethan urged, helping Ruth mount her horse. "Stay in the trees as much as possible. When you reach the main road, look for a stagecoach or a patrol from Fort Laramie. Show them this map and tell them everything." Ruth gripped the reins, torn between the urgency to flee and the fear of leaving Ethan behind. "I'll send help as soon as I can." "I'll be fine," he assured her, with a confidence she suspected he didn't truly feel. "Give Grace my love," if he stopped correcting himself, "when you see her again." Before Ruth could respond, Ethan slapped her horse's flank, sending it lurching forward. She had no choice but to grip the saddle horn and allow the animal to carry her eastward, away from the approaching danger. Behind her, she heard Ethan mounting his own horse, then the sound of him riding deliberately in the opposite direction, making no effort to muffle his passage. He was creating a diversion, drawing their pursuers away from her trail. Tears stung Ruth's eyes, quickly cooling on her fever-warmed cheeks as she rode. Samuel's watch seemed to burn against her skin, where she'd tucked it safely inside her coat, its secret contents now revealed after 3 long years. She followed Ethan's instructions, keeping to the cover of trees where possible, pushing on, despite the growing weakness in her limbs and the fog that occasionally clouded her thoughts. The infection was advancing, stealing her strength hour by hour. But she refused to succumb, driving herself forward with grim determination. By late afternoon, the terrain began to change, the ravine widening and flattening as it approached the main valley. Through gaps in the trees, Ruth caught glimpses of open country ahead and something else, a thin straight line cutting across the landscape. The road to Cheyenne. Hope surged within her, providing a momentary respite from pain and fatigue. She urged her tired mount forward, breaking from the tree line onto a small rise overlooking the road. Below, the rutted track stretched east and west, empty in both directions, save for a single set of wagon tracks partially filled with fresh snow. Ruth guided her horse down the slope, reaching the road with a sense of accomplishment that belied the challenges still ahead. Cheyenne remained a full day's journey, and there was no guarantee of encountering other travelers who might offer assistance. She turned eastward, following the road at a pace her exhausted horse could maintain. As she rode, her thoughts returned to Ethan. Had he escaped Turner and Montgomery's man, or had her flight been purchased with his life? The uncertainty gnawed at her, adding to the burden of physical suffering. The short winter's day was fading toward dusk when Ruth spotted movement ahead, a dark shape against the snow moving slowly westward. As she drew closer, the shape resolved into a covered wagon drawn by a team of mules, a solitary figure hunched on the driver's bench. Ruth urged her horse forward, relief washing over her at the prospect of human contact, of potential help. The wagon driver noticed her approach, pulling back on the reins to halt his team. "Hello there," the man called, as Ruth neared, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. He was elderly, with a full white beard and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades under open skies. "Don't often see lone travelers on this stretch, especially not—" He broke off as Ruth came alongside, his expression shifting to concern. "Ma'am, you're hurt." "I need to reach Cheyenne," Ruth said, her voice weaker than she'd intended. "It's urgent, government business." The old man's bushy eyebrows rose, but he asked no questions, merely nodding as he shifted on the bench. "Climb aboard then. Your horse can follow behind. Name's Josiah Miller, by the way, carrying supplies back from Ironwood." Ruth's heart skipped at the mention of Ironwood. "You've come from there today," Miller nodded, helping her onto the bench beside him once she'd dismounted. "Left just after dawn. Town was in quite a state, something about a jailbreak and a manhunt." He gave her a sidelong glance. "Wouldn't know anything about that, I suppose." Despite everything, Ruth found herself smiling at the old man's perceptiveness. "It might be best if you didn't ask too many questions, Mr. Miller." He chuckled, slapping the reins to set the mules in motion again. "Fair enough. My pa always said the less you know about other folks' troubles, the less likely those troubles are to become your own." He studied her pale face and the blood-stained sleeve of her coat. "Though it seems to me you could use a friend right about now, questions or no." "I could," Ruth admitted, suddenly overwhelmed by exhaustion, now that she was no longer solely responsible for her own survival. "And a doctor when we reach Cheyenne." "Got something better," Miller said, reaching beneath the bench to produce a small leather satchel. "My Mary, God rest her, was a healer. Taught me a thing or two before she passed." He opened the bag, revealing an assortment of small bottles and packets. "Let's have a look at that arm while we ride." Ruth allowed the old man to examine her wound, wincing as he carefully removed Ethan's makeshift bandage. His hands were gentle, despite their size and roughness, his movements precise as he cleaned the injury with a pungent liquid that stung fiercely. "Bullet wound," he observed without inflection. "Clean through at least, no need to dig for metal." He applied a poultice of crushed herbs, then wrapped the arm in fresh bandaging. "This'll draw out some of the infection, but you'll still need a proper doctor when we reach town." "How long to Cheyenne?" Ruth asked, already feeling marginally better from Miller's ministrations. "Normally a full day's journey," the old man replied, "but I've no pressing business, and those mules are accustomed to traveling through the night. If we push on, we could reach the outskirts by dawn." Ruth closed her eyes briefly in relief. "Thank you, Mr. Miller. I can't tell you what this means." The old man nodded, his expression turning serious. "Whatever you're mixed up in, ma'am, I hope it's worth the bot." He gestured to her wounded arm. "That's a high price to pay for any cause." "It is worth it," Ruth said softly, thinking of Samuel, of Ethan, of grace all victims of Montgomery's greed. Some injustices can't be allowed to stand no matter the cost. Miller seemed satisfied with this answer. Then rest if you can, Mrs. Calloway, Ruth supplied. Ruth Calloway. Something flickered in the old man's eyes, recognition perhaps, or surprise. But he made no comment, merely nodding as he encouraged the mules to maintain their steady pace along the snow-covered road. As darkness fell, Ruth drifted in and out of consciousness, the rocking motion of the wagon and the effects of fever creating a dreamlike state where past and present merged. She saw Samuel standing beneath the old oak tree beckoning her forward, saw Ethan facing Turner on the snowy ridge, saw Grace waiting by Wesley's forge, her small face alight with hope for her father's return. Occasionally she surfaced to find Miller offering water or small sips of a bitter herbal tea that seemed to cool her fever. The old man spoke little, respecting her need for rest, but his presence was a comfort in the vast cold emptiness of the Wyoming night. Dawn found them as promised, approaching the outskirts of Cheyenne. The territorial capital was larger than Ironwood, its buildings more substantial, its streets wider and busier even at this early hour. Lights glowed in windows as the town awakened, smoke rising from chimneys into the pale morning sky. "Where to, Mrs. Calloway?" Miller asked as they entered the main street. "The doctor's office, or perhaps the hotel first?" Ruth straightened, mustering her remaining strength. "The territorial governor's office. I need to speak with his representative immediately." Miller raised an eyebrow but asked no questions, merely guiding his team toward the impressive stone building at the center of town. As they drew near, Ruth could see the territorial flag flying above the entrance, a symbol of the authority she desperately needed to enlist. "I'll wait with the wagon," Miller offered as he helped her down from the bench, "in case you need further transportation." Ruth gripped his hand in gratitude. "You're a good man, Mr. Miller. If there's ever anything I can do to repay your kindness." He waved away her words. "Just see that justice is done, whatever it is you're fighting for. That'll be payment enough." The guard at the governor's office was initially reluctant to admit Ruth taking in her disheveled appearance an obvious injury with suspicion. But when she mentioned Montgomery's name and land fraud connected to the railroad, his demeanor changed. "Wait here," he instructed, disappearing into an inner office. Minutes later, a tall, distinguished man emerged, Arthur Donovan, the governor's chief representative, according to the introduction provided by the guard. His keen eyes assessed Ruth, quickly noting her condition with evident concern. "Mrs. Calloway, I believe," he said, gesturing for her to follow him into a private office. "The guard tells me you have information about Victor Montgomery and certain railroad interests." "I do," Ruth confirmed, sinking gratefully into the chair he offered. "Evidence of land fraud, altered surveys, and at least 2 murders, including that of my husband, Samuel Calloway." Donovan's expression sharpened. "Calloway. The name is familiar. There was correspondence from a Samuel Calloway some years ago raising concerns about irregular land transactions in Ironwood County." "Yes," Ruth said, hope rising within her. "Those concerns cost him his life." She withdrew Samuel's watch from her coat, opening it to reveal the hidden map. "This shows the original survey markers for our property, Harper's Hollow, and several adjoining parcels. My husband hid the markers before his death as proof that Montgomery had altered the surveys to claim land for the railroad." Donovan examined the map carefully, his frown deepening. "This is serious evidence, Mrs. Calloway, but I'm afraid it's not enough by itself to bring charges against someone as powerful as Montgomery." Ruth's heart sank. After everything, the danger, the pain, Ethan's sacrifice, would it all be for nothing? "However," Donovan continued, "it does corroborate other complaints we've received. The governor has been building a case against certain railroad interests for some time. Your evidence could be the key piece we've been missing." Hope flickered again in Ruth's chest. "Then you'll stop Montgomery." "We'll investigate immediately," Donovan assured her. "But first you need medical attention. And I'll need a full statement from you about everything you've witnessed." Ruth nodded, relief washing over her in a wave that left her lightheaded. "There's more you should know. Ethan Foster, he was investigating on behalf of the governor's office. He's in danger. Montgomery's hired gunman, Silas Turner, was pursuing us. Foster stayed behind to draw them away while I escaped." Donovan's expression turned grim. "Foster is one of our best investigators. If he's in danger, we need to act quickly." He rose, crossing to the door to issue instructions to the guard outside. I'm sending a telegram to Fort Laramie requesting an immediate patrol of the area you described and arranging for a doctor to see you here." Ruth sagged in her chair, the last of her strength ebbing now that she had fulfilled her mission. She had done all she could. The rest was in the hands of others. The next hours passed in a blur. A doctor arrived to properly clean and dress her wound, administering laudanum for the pain and antibiotics for the infection. Ruth provided her statement to Donovan, recounting everything from Samuel's initial suspicions to Ethan's arrival at Harper's Hollow, the discovery of the coal seam, and their desperate flight toward Cheyenne. By late afternoon, her fever had begun to subside, and she was settled in a comfortable room at Cheyenne's finest hotel, courtesy of the territorial government. Donovan assured her that a patrol had been dispatched from Fort Laramie to search for Ethan and apprehend Turner. A larger force, including federal marshals, was preparing to ride for Ironwood to arrest Montgomery and seize his records. "Rest now, Mrs. Calloway," Donovan advised as he prepared to leave. "You've done more than enough. We'll handle matters from here." But rest eluded Ruth despite her exhaustion and the lingering effects of the laudanum. Her thoughts circled endlessly around Ethan, imagining his fate at Turner's hands. And Grace, what would become of the child if her father did not return? As darkness fell, Ruth made her decision. Rising unsteadily, she dressed and made her way downstairs where Josiah Miller waited, as promised, with his wagon. "Mr. Miller," she said as she approached, "I need to return to Ironwood immediately." The old man studied her face, then nodded without question. "Figured as much. Wagon's ready when you are." They traveled through the night, the mules maintaining a steady pace along the snow-covered road. Ruth's strength gradually returned as the infection retreated, though her arm remained painful and stiff. Miller asked few questions, seeming content to offer his assistance without explanation. It was near dawn when Ruth finally broached the subject that had nagged at her since their first meeting. "You recognized my name yesterday. You knew Samuel, didn't you?" Miller was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I did," he finally acknowledged. "Not well, but enough to know he was a good man. Too good for what happened to him." "What do you mean?" The old man sighed, his breath clouding in the cold air. "I was there the day they found him crushed under that wagon. Happened to be passing on my way to Cheyenne." He glanced at Ruth. "That axle didn't break by accident, Mrs. Calloway. It was cut most of the way through, designed to snap under pressure." Ruth's breath caught. Though she had suspected the truth for years, hearing it confirmed by an eyewitness made it suddenly painfully real. "Did you tell the sheriff?" "I tried," Miller said grimly, "but Davis was already in Montgomery's pocket by then. Said I was an old fool who didn't know machinery. Suggested I move on before I caused trouble." He shook his head. "I've regretted my silence ever since. When you told me your name yesterday, I knew the Lord was giving me a chance to make it right." They rode in silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts, as the sun rose over the eastern horizon, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. By mid-morning, they had reached the ridge overlooking Ironwood, the town spread below them like a collection of children's toys. "Something's happening down there," Miller observed, pointing to unusual activity in the main street. Ruth squinted, making out a gathering of people around what appeared to be a group of horsemen. As they drew closer, descending the road into town, she recognized the distinctive uniforms of federal marshals. "Donovan must have sent them ahead of us," she said, hope rising in her chest. "They're arresting Montgomery." They entered town just as the marshals were leading a handcuffed Victor Montgomery from the bank. The townsfolk watched in stunned silence as the man who had ruled Ironwood with an iron fist for years was helped unceremoniously onto a prison wagon. Ruth directed Miller to Wesley's blacksmith shop, her heart pounding with anxiety over what news she might find there. The forge was cold, the shop apparently empty, but as they pulled up, the door opened to reveal Wesley himself, his weathered face breaking into a broad smile at the sight of her. "Ruth Calloway," he exclaimed, hurrying forward to help her down from the wagon. "By God, I never thought to see you again in this life." "Wesley," Ruth gripped his hands tightly. "Grace, is she?" "Safe and sound," the old blacksmith assured her, gesturing toward the shop. Inside with her payum, Ruth's heart seemed to stop. "Ethan, he's alive." Wesley nodded, his eyes twinkling. "Arrived yesterday, half frozen but whole. Got quite a tale to tell, that one." Ruth rushed inside, Miller and Wesley following more slowly. The shop's interior was warm, the forge now lit and casting a ruddy glow over the simple furnishings. And there, seated on a bench with Grace curled against his side, was Ethan Foster. He looked up as she entered, his face lighting with awe and disbelief. Ruth Grace spotted her a moment later, launching herself across the room to wrap small arms around Ruth's waist. "Mrs. Calloway, you came back. Papa said you were." Ruth knelt to embrace the child properly, tears of relief stinging her eyes. Over Grace's shoulder, she met Ethan's gaze, the unspoken question clear in her expression. "Turner let me go," he said, simply rising to cross the room toward her. "What?" Ruth couldn't hide her shock. "The gunslinger. But why?" Ethan's expression was complicated, surprise, gratitude, and lingering confusion. "He caught up to me near the Ross property, had me dead to rights, could have shot me where I stood." He shook his head as if still puzzled by the memory. Instead, he asked about Hannah, wanted to know how she died. Ruth remembered Turner's cold eyes, his reputation as a merciless killer. "Why would he care about your wife?" "Because," Ethan said slowly, "Hannah was his sister." A stunned silence followed this revelation, broken only by the soft crackling of the forge fire. "His sister," Ruth finally managed. "But then he didn't know," Ethan explained. "Not until I told him how she died, that Montgomery had ordered her killed, when she discovered his fraud. Turner thought it was a random robbery gone wrong." His expression hardened. "Turns out Montgomery had hired him with the specific instruction never to ask questions about previous jobs in the territory." Wesley gave a low whistle. "That explains the other news from town this morning. They found Montgomery's assistant, Jacob Turner, dead in his office. Single-shot professional job. No sign of the shooter." "Turner," Ruth breathed. "He killed Montgomery's man, then disappeared." Ethan nodded. "He told me he had unfinished business in Ironwood, then let me go. Said his quarrel wasn't with me anymore." A faint smile touched his lips. "Even gave me his horse for the journey back." The pieces fell into place in Ruth's mind. Turner's cold efficiency, his reputation for never failing a job, the personal code of honor that Wesley had mentioned. Learning that his employer had orchestrated his own sister's murder would have violated that code in the most profound way possible. "And the federal marshals?" Ethan asked. "I see they've arrived." "Thanks to Ruth," Wesley said proudly. "She made it to Cheyenne, got the governor's office involved. They're arresting Montgomery and seizing all his records." Ethan's eyes found Ruth's, filled with admiration and something deeper. Something that made her heart quicken, despite her exhaustion. "You did it," he said softly. "You finished what Samuel started." "What we all started," Ruth corrected. "Samuel, Hannah, you, even Silas Turner in his way." She looked around at the unlikely gathering, a blacksmith, a freight driver, a lawyer, a child, and a widow bound together by a common pursuit of justice. Montgomery thought wealth and power would protect him from consequences. He was wrong. The day unfolded with a sense of unreality as federal authorities took control of Ironwood. Montgomery's associates were arrested, his records seized, his property placed under government control. Sheriff Davis, faced with evidence of his complicity, resigned his position rather than face charges, his son's medical education now in jeopardy. Through it all, Ruth remained at Wesley's shop with Ethan and Grace, receiving updates from the marshals who sought their testimony for the coming trials. By evening, the initial furor had died down, leaving the town in a state of stunned adjustment to its new reality. As night fell, Ruth found herself standing on Wesley's small porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear winter sky. The events of the past week seemed almost dreamlike. Now the desperate flight through the snow, the confrontation with Turner, the race to Cheyenne with infection burning through her veins. Yet it had all been real, and the consequences would reshape not just her life, but the future of Ironwood itself. The railroad would still come, progress couldn't be halted indefinitely, but it would follow the original legitimate surveys respecting existing property rights. The coal beneath Harper's Hollow would eventually be mined, but under fair contracts that would provide Ruth with a comfortable income for the rest of her life. Samuel's killer had not faced justice in a court of law, but Montgomery would spend years in a territorial prison for his other crimes. It was not perfect justice, but it was more than Ruth had dared hope for during her 3 years of silent grief. Footsteps sounded behind her, and she turned to find Ethan approaching, a blanket in his hands, which he gently draped around her shoulders. "You'll catch your death out here," he chided softly. "Haven't you had enough adventure for one lifetime?" Ruth smiled, drawing the blanket closer against the cold. Perhaps, but I find I'm not ready to return to the quiet existence I had before. Ethan leaned against the porch railing, his shoulder brushing hers. What will you do now? Return to Harper's Hollow. Eventually, she nodded. It's still my home, burned barn and all. There's rebuilding to be done. She glanced at him. And will you continue your work for the governor's office? A thoughtful expression crossed his face. I've been considering a change. The territorial judge has offered me a position here in Ironwood to help reorganize the legal system after Montgomery's corruption is rooted out. He hesitated. It would mean settling here permanently, with Grace. The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but clear. Ruth felt a flutter of something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope, possibility, the prospect of a future not defined by loss and isolation. Ironwood could use good people, she said carefully. People committed to justice, to building something worthwhile. Harper's Hollow isn't far from town. Ethan observed, his voice equally measured. Close enough for regular visits. Ruth turned to face him, fully finding in his eyes the same careful hope that bloomed in her own heart. Grace mentioned she'd like to learn more about keeping chickens, she said, a smile tugging at her lips. Apparently she has quite a way with them. Ethan laughed softly, the sound warm in the cold night air. She's been talking about those chickens since we left your ranch. I think she named each one. Did she? Ruth felt a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the blanket around her shoulders. Well, then it would be cruel to keep them separated for too long. Ethan's hand found hers on the porch railing, his fingers entwining with hers in a gesture that felt both new and somehow familiar. Ruth, he said, his voice gentle in the darkness. I'm not Samuel. I can never replace what you lost. I'm not asking you to, she replied softly. And you're not asking me to replace Hannah, but perhaps we can build something new, something that honors what we've lost while embracing what might be. The distant sound of Grace's laughter drifted through the shop's open door. She was showing Wesley how to knit using the same determination with which she approached everything in life. The sound wrapped around Ruth and Ethan like a promise, a glimpse of possibilities neither had dared imagine just days ago. I'd like that, Ethan said, his voice husky with emotion, to build something new, together. Ruth leaned slightly against his shoulder, looking up at the vast Wyoming sky, where stars shone with unwavering clarity. Samuel had loved these stars, had taught her the constellations during their first summer at Harper's Hollow. She liked to think he was among them now, along with Hannah, and all those who had been lost to Montgomery's greed. Together, she agreed the word both a commitment and a prayer. Spring came early to Harper's Hollow that year, the snow retreating to reveal tender green shoots pushing through the soil. The new barn stood where the old one had burned its fresh timber, gleaming in the sunshine, built by hands from across Ironwood County neighbors, helping neighbors in a way that hadn't happened since before Montgomery's influence had divided the community. Ruth stood on the porch watching as Ethan and Grace approached on horseback, returning from their week in town, where Ethan's duties as legal advisor kept him occupied Monday through Friday. Weekends, however, belonged to Harper's Hollow, to the slow, careful building of new routines and shared memories. Grace dismounted before her horse had fully stopped racing toward the chicken coop, where her feathered friends awaited their weekly reunion. Ethan followed more sedately, his smile growing as he approached the porch where Ruth waited. Welcome home. She said the words still new enough to bring a flush to her cheeks. It's good to be back, he replied, mounting the steps to stand beside her. Judge Harrison sends his regards. The final paperwork for the coal rights is complete. The terms are exactly as we discussed. Ruth nodded, but her mind wasn't on legal matters at the moment. Wesley's coming for dinner tomorrow. Says he has something to show Grace. Another knitting project, Ethan chuckled. The man's taken to it with surprising enthusiasm. Actually, I think it's a small anvil and hammer he's made for her. Says she has a natural talent for metalwork. They shared a smile at the unlikely bond that had formed between the gruff old blacksmith and the spirited young girl. Wesley had become a fixture in their lives, a surrogate grandfather to Grace, and a living connection to Samuel for Ruth. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Ruth and Ethan watched Grace racing across the newly planted fields, her laughter carrying on the spring breeze. The future stretched before them, not without challenges, but filled with a hope that neither had thought to find again. Harper's Hollow had once been defined by boundaries, lines on maps, property markers, the strict delineation between Ruth's solitary existence and the world beyond. But those boundaries had proven more permeable than she had imagined, than allowing love and connection to find their way back into her life when she least expected it. Later, as twilight deepened into night, Ruth stood beside the old oak tree at the eastern boundary of the property, the tree where Samuel had hidden the original survey markers that had helped bring Montgomery to justice. She placed a hand against its rough bark, feeling the life pulsing beneath. "We did it, Sam," she whispered to the quiet night. "It took time, but we got there in the end." From the house, warm light spilled from the windows where Ethan was helping Grace with her reading lesson. Ruth turned toward home, toward the future that awaited, carrying Samuel's memory, not as a burden, but as a foundation upon which something new could grow. The boundaries of justice had been restored. The boundaries of her heart had been redrawn. And in that space between what had been lost and what had been found, Ruth Calloway had discovered that the most important boundaries were not those marked on maps or deeds, but the ones we choose to cross when love and courage call us forward. 5 years later, the whistle of the approaching train echoed across the valley, a sound that still held novelty even after 3 years of regular service to Ironwood Station. Ruth paused in her gardening, wiping soil from her hands as she straightened to watch the plume of smoke rising above the tree line to the east. Harper's Hollow had changed since that fateful winter. The modest ranch had expanded not just in acreage, but in purpose. Where once a solitary widow had struggled to maintain her late husband's dream, now stood a thriving homestead that served as both residence and unofficial community gathering place. The new barn, larger than its predecessor, housed not only livestock, but a small schoolroom where Ruth taught local children 3 days a week. The original cabin had been expanded, a new wing added to accommodate the growing household. A short distance away near the creek, the mining company's office stood as a reminder of the compromise that had allowed progress without surrender. The coal beneath Harper's Hollow was being extracted, but on terms that respected both the land and its owners. Ruth smiled as she heard the familiar sound of hoofbeats approaching from the direction of town. Right on schedule as always. Ethan Foster now. Judge Foster of the Territorial Court was nothing if not punctual. She moved toward the house, removing her gardening apron as she went. On the porch, she caught sight of her reflection in the window glass, a woman in her early 40s. Her face tanned from outdoor work, faint lines at the corners of her eyes that spoke of both hardship and laughter. Not so different from the widow who had once faced down Victor Montgomery, yet changed in ways that went beyond the physical. The rider came into view, and Ruth's smile widened. Not one horse, but two. Ethan, and beside him, Grace. At 14, the girl had blossomed into a striking young woman with her father's steady gaze and a confidence all her own. She rode astride, much to the scandal of Ironwood's more traditional residents, her dark hair braided and tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat. "Ruth," Grace called, spotting her on the porch and waving enthusiastically. The girl urged her mount into a gallop, pulling ahead of her father in her eagerness to reach the house. Ruth descended the steps to meet her as Grace dismounted in a fluid motion that spoke of years of practice. "Easy," Ruth cautioned with a laugh as the girl flung her arms around her in greeting. "You'll have us both in the dirt." "Sorry," Grace replied, not sounding sorry at all. "But wait until you hear Papa's got news from the Capitol." Ethan approached at a more dignified pace, his smile warm as he dismounted and secured both horses to the hitching post. The years had been kind to him, the silver now touching his temples, lending him a distinguished air that suited his position as a respected jurist. "I see my daughter has already been making announcements on my behalf," he said, dryly embracing Ruth with the comfortable familiarity of long partnership. "She mentioned news," Ruth replied, but exercised remarkable restraint in not revealing the details. "Only because Papa made me promise not to tell until we were all together," Grace interjected, "even though I nearly burst keeping it secret the whole ride from town." Ruth raised an eyebrow. "Well, we're all together now. Should we go inside, or is this news that can be shared in the open air?" "Inside," Ethan suggested. "Thomas should hear this too." At the mention of her son, Ruth's expression softened. "He's down for his nap, but should be waking soon." They entered the house together, moving into the large sun-filled kitchen that had become the heart of the home. Grace immediately went to the stove, lifting the lid on the pot of stew that simmered there and inhaling appreciatively. "Venison?" she asked. Ruth nodded. "Mr. Jenkins brought it by yesterday, said to thank your father for his help with that boundary dispute last month." Ethan shook his head, amused. The barter system is alive and well in Ironwood County, despite my best efforts to modernize the legal system. Some traditions are worth preserving, Ruth observed, pouring coffee for Ethan and milk for Grace. Now this news you've been so mysterious about. Ethan reached into his coat pocket, withdrawing an official-looking letter bearing the territorial seal. It arrived by special courier this morning, he said, placing it on the table between them, from Governor Harrison himself. Ruth glanced at the letter, then back at Ethan, a question in her eyes. Statehood, he said simply. Wyoming is to become the 44th state of the Union, and the first to grant women full voting rights in its constitution. Ruth's breath caught. Though the territorial legislature had granted it women's suffrage years earlier, statehood would cement those rights permanently, rights she and many other women had fought to preserve during the Constitutional Convention. When she asked, July, Ethan replied. President Harrison has already indicated he'll sign the bill. There's more, he added, his expression now holding a hint of pride mixed with something like nervous anticipation. The governor has asked me to stand for election to the state Supreme Court. Grace could contain herself no longer. Isn't it wonderful Papa would be Justice Foster? Ruth reached across the table, taking Ethan's hand. It's a tremendous honor, she said softly, and well-deserved. A shadow crossed his face. It would mean moving to Cheyenne at least part of the time. The court sits there 8 months of the year. The implications hung in the air between them. For 5 years they had maintained their arrangement, Ethan in town during the week at Harper's Hollow on weekends and holidays. It had worked well, allowing both to pursue their callings while building a life together. Grace had divided her time between town and ranch, receiving both formal education and practical knowledge. And for the past 3 years, since she and Ethan had finally married, their family had grown to include young Thomas. We would all move, Ruth said after a moment's consideration. Harper's Hollow has Wesley and the mining company supervisor to look after it. The school has Mary Jenkins to take my place. She smiled at Grace's expression of surprise. Did you think I would choose land over family? The land will wait for us. Thomas deserves to have his father present for more than 2 days a week. A cry from the next room interrupted their conversation. Thomas, awake from his nap, his timing impeccable as always. Grace jumped up. I'll get him, she offered, already moving toward the nursery. Alone briefly, Ruth and Ethan exchanged a look laden with years of shared understanding. Are you certain? He asked. Harper's Hollow is your home, Samuel's home. Ruth's gaze traveled around the kitchen, taking in the space where so much of her life had unfolded, joy and grief, endings and beginnings. Samuel loved this land, she said thoughtfully, but what he truly wanted was for it to support a family, to be a place of life and growth. She returned her attention to Ethan. We've honored that, and we'll continue to, even if we're not here every day. Before Ethan could respond, Grace returned with Thomas in her arms, the 2-year-old boy blinking sleepily as he clutched his favorite wooden horse, a gift from Wesley, who had become the grandson he'd never had. Look who's awake, Grace said, depositing the child in Ruth's lap. Thomas looked up at his mother, with Samuel's eyes a genetic echo that had startled Ruth when she first noticed it, but now brought only a gentle acknowledgement of the past presence in the present. The boy had Ethan's thoughtful nature, however, observing the world with a careful attention that suggested he would follow his father into scholarly pursuits rather than ranching. Mama, he said, patting her cheek with a small hand. Sorry, Ruth laughed. Later, little one. First, we have news to discuss. She looked up at Grace, who had taken a seat beside Ethan. Your father has been offered a position on the state Supreme Court. It would mean moving to Cheyenne. Grace's expression registered surprise, followed quickly by consideration. At 14, she was old enough to understand the significance of such a change. What about school and Wesley's blacksmith lessons? You'd attend the academy in Cheyenne, Ethan explained. It's an excellent school with opportunities Ironwood can't offer. He smiled. As for Wesley, I suspect he'd be delighted to have an excuse to visit the capital regularly. He's been talking about expanding his business. Grace nodded slowly, processing this information. What about Harper's Hollow? We wouldn't sell it, would we? Never, Ruth assured her. This will always be our home, even if we live elsewhere for a time. We'll return for summer's holidays whenever court is not in session. The girl's expression cleared. Then I think it's a wonderful opportunity. She grinned suddenly. And think of all the new books in Cheyenne. Mr. Peterson says the library there has volumes from all over the world. Ruth exchanged an amused glance with Ethan. Grace's appetite for reading had proven insatiable, a trait that endeared her to both adults who had encouraged her education at every turn. Already she spoke of attending university someday, a dream that once would have seemed impossible for a girl from Wyoming territory, but now appeared within reach. Thomas, growing restless in Ruth's lap, squirmed down to the floor and toddled over to the window, pressing his face against the glass. "Wes," he announced, pointing. Sure enough, Wesley Cooper's wagon was approaching the house, the old blacksmith himself at the reins, despite his advancing years. Beside him sat another familiar figure, Josiah Miller, the freight driver, whose timely assistance had helped Ruth reach Cheyenne during that desperate winter journey. "Perfect timing," Ruth remarked, rising to put on a fresh pot of coffee. "We can share the news with them as well." Grace hurried outside to greet the visitors, Thomas following as quickly as his short legs would carry him. Ethan moved to help Ruth with the coffee preparations, a domestic rhythm they had perfected over the years. "You're really willing to leave Harper's Hollow?" he asked quietly, the question that had lingered between them finally voiced. Ruth turned to face him, her expression serene. "I'm willing to follow where life leads us, Ethan. Just as you were willing to step away from your work for the governor to help rebuild Ironwood." She touched his face gently. "We've both learned that home isn't about place, it's about people." Wesley's booming laugh echoed from outside, followed by Thomas's delighted squeal. The sounds of family, not the one Ruth had originally envisioned when she first came to Harper's Hollow as Samuel's bride, but family nonetheless forged through shared struggle and mutual choice. The afternoon unfolded with the comfortable familiarity of long-established friendship. Wesley and Miller joined them for a late lunch. The news of Ethan's appointment and Wyoming's impending statehood met with enthusiastic approval from both men. "About time they recognized what we've known for years," Wesley declared, raising his coffee cup in salute to Ethan. "You've done more for justice in this territory than any three men before you." "Hear, hear," Miller agreed, his weathered face creased in a smile. "Though I reckon we'll miss having you just down the road, Judge." "I've already told Ruth," Ethan said. "The position requires residence in Cheyenne only during court sessions. Harper's Hollow will remain our home." Wesley nodded approvingly. "As it should be. Too much history here to abandon it entirely." He glanced at Ruth. "Speaking of history, that reminds me of my purpose in visiting today beyond the pleasure of your company." From his coat pocket, he withdrew a small cloth-wrapped bundle. "Found this while clearing out some old storage at the shop. Thought you might want it." Ruth accepted the bundle, carefully unwrapping the fabric to reveal a tarnished metal object, a deputy's badge, its silver surface dulled with age. "Samuel's," she breathed, recognizing it immediately. Before his ranching days, Samuel had served briefly as a deputy in Ironwood during the town's early years. Wesley nodded. "Found it in a box of items James Harker left when he sold me the smithy. Must have been turned in when Samuel resigned to take up ranching full-time." He looked slightly embarrassed. "Should have found it years ago, but you know how old men are about getting around to organizing things." Ruth ran her finger over the badge, feeling the weight of memory it carried. "Thank you, Wesley. This means a great deal." The old blacksmith cleared his throat gruffly. "Thought young Thomas might like to have it someday. Know something of his namesake." The badge had started a flow of reminiscence, and soon the kitchen rang with stories, Wesley and Miller trading tales of the early days, Ethan recounting his first impressions of Ironwood, Ruth sharing memories of Samuel that now brought smiles rather than pain. Grace listened intently, absorbing the oral history with the same concentration she applied to her formal studies. Though she had been young when these events occurred, she had grown up hearing the story of how her father and Ruth had exposed Montgomery's corruption and brought justice to Ironwood. It had shaped her understanding of right and wrong, of courage and principle. As afternoon stretched toward evening, the conversation turned to the future Ethan's plans for his new position, the changes statehood would bring to Wyoming, Grace's education in Cheyenne. "The world's changing faster than an old man can keep up with," Miller observed, watching Thomas play with wooden blocks on the floor beside the table. "Railroad statehood, women voting. Who knows what this young fellow will see in his lifetime?" "Progress, I hope," Ethan said, "but progress guided by justice and fairness, not just profit and expansion." Wesley snorted. You sound like a judge already. As laughter filled the room, Ruth found herself momentarily apart from it, a silent observer to the tapestry of connection that had been woven around her. From the depths of grief and isolation, she had emerged into this, a house filled with voices, with belonging, with purpose, shared and multiplied. Later, after their guests had departed, and Ethan had taken Thomas for his pre-bedtime ride around the property, a ritual the boy insisted upon regardless of weather, Ruth found herself drawn to the old oak tree at the eastern boundary. The massive tree stood as it had for generations, its branches now in full summer leaf, casting deep shade over the grass below. She sat on the carved bench Ethan had placed there during their second year together, a spot where she often came to remember to measure the distance traveled from who she had been to who she had become. "I'm leaving for a while, Sam," she said softly to the presence she still sometimes felt among the rustling leaves. "Not forever, but for a season or two. Ethan needs to be in Cheyenne and the children, and I need to be with him." The wind stirred the branches above, sending dappled sunlight dancing across the ground at her feet. "I used to think honoring your memory meant keeping everything exactly as it was when you were alive," she continued. "Preserving Harper's Hollow like a monument. But that was never what you wanted for this land, was it? You wanted it lived on, worked, filled with family." In the distance, she could see Ethan and Thomas returning from their ride, the man's tall figure and the child perched before him on the saddle, forming a silhouette against the evening sky. "I found love again," she said, the words still holding a hint of wonder even after all this time. "Not a replacement for what we had, nothing could replace that. But something new, something I never expected." She smiled. "I think you'd approve of the man who's helping raise your namesake. He has your sense of justice, your stubborn integrity." The sound of Grace's voice floated from the direction of the house, calling Ethan and Thomas in for supper, no doubt. Ruth rose from the bench, brushing her skirt smooth with practiced hands. "We'll be back," she promised the old oak, the land, the memories that resided here. "This will always be where we began." As she walked back toward the house, toward the family waiting for her, Ruth reflected on the boundaries that had shaped her life. The physical boundaries of property and territory, yes, but also the invisible ones between past and present, grief and joy, ending and beginning. Some boundaries existed to be defended, as she and Samuel and Ethan had defended Harper's Hollow against Montgomery's greed. Others existed to be transcended, as she had transcended the boundary of her grief to find new purpose and connection. The true wisdom Ruth had learned lay in knowing which boundaries to maintain and which to cross, and in having the courage to do both when necessary. The Cheyenne house was smaller than Harper's Hollow, but elegant in its urban sophistication, a two-story residence on a tree-lined street not far from the Capitol building. As befitted the home of a state Supreme Court justice, it featured a handsome study lined with law books, a formal dining room for entertaining, and a small but well-tended garden that Ruth had claimed as her domain from the first day. 6 months into their new life, the family had established routines that bridged their dual existence between city and country. Ethan's court duties kept him occupied during the week, while Ruth divided her time between managing the household, volunteering with the Women's Suffrage Association, and tutoring Thomas, who would begin formal schooling the following year. Grace had blossomed at the Cheyenne Academy, her natural intelligence and curiosity earning her top marks, and the attention of teachers who encouraged her to consider college, perhaps even back east, where women's education was becoming more established. On this particular evening, Ruth stood in the doorway of Grace's room, watching as the girl prepared for the Governor's Ball, an annual event that, as the daughter of a Supreme Court justice, she was now old enough to attend. "You look beautiful," Ruth said softly, taking in the sight of Grace in her first formal gown, a deep blue creation that complemented her dark hair and brought out the clarity of her eyes. Grace turned from the mirror, uncharacteristically uncertain. "Are you sure it's not too much? Some of the girls at school said blue was too bold for a first ball." Ruth entered the room, adjusting the simple silver necklace at Grace's throat, her own contribution to the evening's ensemble. "Bold suits you," she said firmly. "And this particular shade reminds me of the Wyoming sky at dusk depth and possibility all at once." A smile broke through Grace's nervousness. "That's what I thought too when we saw it in the shop." She smoothed the fabric with careful hands. "Do you think Papa will approve?" "Your father," came Ethan's voice from the doorway, "thinks his daughter looks like the most elegant young woman in all of Wyoming territory, forgive me, state." Grace's face lit up at the sight of him resplendent in his formal attire, the gravity of his judicial position evident in his bearing, yet softened by the pride in his eyes as he beheld his daughter. "You don't think it's too grown up?" she asked, seeking reassurance. Ethan shook his head, momentarily speechless in the way of fathers confronting the swift passage of their daughters from childhood to young womanhood. "I think," he said finally, "that your mother would be very proud to see you tonight." The mention of Hannah, rare but never forbidden in their household, brought a particular softness to Grace's expression. "Do you really think so?" "I know so," Ethan assured her. "She had your same spirit, your same intelligence, and she would have loved seeing you step into this new chapter of your life." Ruth watched this exchange with a full heart, grateful for Ethan's ability to keep Hannah's memory alive for Grace while still embracing their present family configuration. There was no jealousy in her regarding his first wife. How could there be when Hannah's daughter had become as dear to her as her own child? "Speaking of new chapters," Ruth said, moving to straighten Ethan's already perfect tie, "have you told Grace about our surprise?" Ethan's eyes twinkled. "I was saving it for the right moment." "What surprise?" Grace demanded, instantly alert. "Well," Ethan said, drawing out the moment, "it seems that Wesley has decided to expand his blacksmith business after all by opening a second location here in Cheyenne." Grace's eyes widened. "Here, Wesley is coming to Cheyenne." "Not permanently," Ruth clarified. "He's sending his apprentice to run the new shop. But he'll be visiting regularly to oversee operations. And," she added with a meaningful look at Ethan, "he's asked if a certain young lady might be interested in continuing her metalwork lessons during those visits." A squeal of delight escaped Grace, a sound that momentarily transformed the poised young woman back into the enthusiastic child they knew so well. "Really? Oh, that's wonderful." Her expression suddenly shifted to concern. "But what will the academy say ladies aren't supposed to pursue blacksmithing?" "Ladies weren't supposed to vote either," Ruth pointed out dryly. "Yet here we are in the first state to guarantee that right. Times are changing, Grace. And in any case, I've already spoken with Headmistress Collins. She's quite progressive in her views on women's education and sees no reason why metalworking should be forbidden as an artistic pursuit." Grace laughed, the sound pure and unrestrained. Artistic pursuit. That's one way to describe Wesley's hammering. A knock at the front door signaled the arrival of their carriage. The governor's ball awaited the first of many such events in their new social circle. As they descended the stairs, Thomas appeared from the kitchen, where Mrs. Perkins, their housekeeper, had been entertaining him. "Grace Pretty," the boy announced, clapping his hands at the sight of his sister in her finery. Grace stooped, careful of her dress, to embrace him. "Thank you, Thomas. You be good for Mrs. Perkins, and tomorrow I'll tell you all about the ball." As they prepared to depart, Ruth felt a momentary pang of nostalgia for Harper's Hollow, for quiet evenings by the fire, for the sound of wind through the old oak's branches, for the simplicity of ranch life that had been her world for so many years. Ethan, perceptive as always, caught her expression. "Missing home?" he asked softly as they waited for Grace to don her wrap. "Just reflecting on the journey," Ruth replied. "From that snowy night when you appeared in my barn to this attending the governor's ball as a justice's family." "Life takes unexpected turns," Ethan agreed, offering his arm as they stepped out into the crisp autumn evening. "But I find I'm grateful for everyone that led us here." The carriage awaited, polished and elegant, so different from the weathered wagon that had once been Ruth's transportation into Ironwood. As they settled inside, she gazed out at the lamplit streets of Cheyenne, a city growing and changing as rapidly as the new state itself. Wyoming stretched before them, a land of harsh beauty and boundless possibility. The boundaries that had once confined Ruth's existence had expanded, encompassing not just Harper's Hollow, but this wider world of influence and opportunity. And as the carriage pulled away from their temporary home toward the glittering promise of the governor's ball, Ruth Calloway Foster realized that the greatest journey had not been the physical one from ranch to city, but the internal passage from grief to joy, from isolation to connection, from survival to truly living. The boundaries of justice had been her beginning, but love, unexpected, unlooked for, yet embraced with courage, would be her continuing story.